On the afternoon of March 24th, 2006, an employee at a moving truck rental company in Ohio opened his desk drawer and grabbed a wad of cash. It had been a slow day, so the employee was using his downtime to organize a few recent payments. The money he had just grabbed was from an all-cash deal that had happened a few days ago. At the time, the employee had been super busy, so he'd just taken the cash from the customer, flipped through it quickly to make sure the amount seemed right, then shoved the money in the drawer to deal with later. Now he was actually counting it properly, and he really hoped the customer had not shorted him, or he would have to track them down to collect the rest. But as the employee counted the bills, he paused. Not because the amount wasn't right, but because there was something on the money that caught his attention. For a second, he wasn't sure what it was, so he looked closer. And then, all at once, he understood what he was seeing. He stopped counting the money and just began flipping through it as quickly as he could, and he kept seeing the same thing on almost all the bills. With his heart racing, the employee just dropped the money, grabbed the phone, and called the police. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to cut the follow button's grass for them, but set the blades so low that it just obliterates the grass and leaves only dirt. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of Thursday, March 9th, 2006, a 50-year-old woman named Karen Divalbliss sat in the passenger seat of her car. Her husband, 71-year-old Jim Divalbliss, was behind the wheel, driving them through downtown Lancaster, Ohio. Karen looked out the window and watched as they passed historic buildings, shops, and restaurants. Every once in a while, Jim slowed down and waved at people on the sidewalk, because he and Karen knew practically everybody in town. So Lancaster was a small suburb of about 36,000 people, and it was generally a friendly blue-collar place. Karen and Jim had lived there for over a decade, and they were well known in the community, mostly because of their business ventures. They owned multiple rental properties around town, and also a store where they sold electronics, toys, and hobby supplies. The properties and the store had not only made Karen and Jim a lot of friends, but also a lot of money. They had a reputation for being very wealthy, but also very generous. They went out of their way to help people who were down on their luck, especially friends and family. Karen's former sister-in-law, whose name was Deanna Smith, had actually been living in one of their rental properties for a long time now, and Karen's son was an employee at their store. But even now, with all of their success and their kindness, Karen knew that a lot of people in town viewed her and Jim as kind of an odd couple. They'd both been married before and had kids from their first marriages, and on paper, they didn't seem like obvious partners. Jim was 21 years older than Karen, and he also tended to be pretty quiet and reserved. Karen, on the other hand, was usually the loudest person in the room. But despite their differences, they just worked, and really that was all that mattered to them. Just then, Karen felt the car slow to a stop. She looked out the window and saw that they were at their first stop of the evening, the hobby store that they owned. There was a big sign outside that said the store's name, D&D Sales. The sign looked exceptionally bright and clean, which should have made Karen happy. But in reality, it actually made her feel kind of annoyed. The sign had recently been repainted by Karen and Jim's regular handyman, and he'd done a great job with it, and Karen had paid him what she owed him for the work. But then, after she paid him, he kept demanding more money. Now, Karen prided herself on being generous, but she'd felt like the handyman was now trying to take advantage of her. So, she had told him that if he wanted to earn more money, she could give him another repair job. Now, ultimately, he had agreed to do another job, but he'd made it very clear that he was not happy about it, and things had been tense between him and Karen ever since. But luckily, the handyman was not at the store that day. Karen was actually here to see somebody else, her 27-year-old son, Jeremy Moore. She could see him inside the shop through the window, manning the front counter. He was tall, skinny, and had dark hair and earrings. Jeremy was her only son from her first marriage, and they usually got along really well. When Karen and Jim first opened D&D Sales, they'd given Jeremy a job, and he'd been a great employee. Karen had felt like she could really trust him, and she'd given him a lot of independence. But then, that all changed, because Jeremy had started getting into serious trouble. He'd never really been a troublemaker, but it was like all of a sudden he had gotten arrested for stealing. And when he came back to work after that, his performance had majorly slipped. He'd started showing up late or not showing up at all. And on top of that, some of Karen and Jim's other store employees had begun complaining that they didn't like working with him because he was moody and angry. And so this had put Karen in a pretty awkward position because she loved Jeremy and she wanted him to succeed. And family or not, she just wasn't in the habit of firing people or leaving them high and dry when they were having a hard time. But at the same time, she also didn't want Jeremy's attitude and performance to affect her business. So she had sort of made it a point to check in on him while he was working. Karen told Jim she'd be right back, and she got out of the car. She went inside the store and asked her son how he was doing. And he seemed annoyed to be asked and just told her that, everything was fine. So Karen did a quick sweep of the store to make sure all the shelves were stocked and the aisles were clean. Everything looked good, so she went back to the front counter and told Jeremy she loved him, and then headed back outside to the car. A few minutes later, Karen and Jim pulled up to their second stop of the evening, their favorite bowling alley, which was called Tiki Lanes. In addition to being business people, Karen and Jim were avid bowlers. They were in 3 different bowling leagues and came to Tiki Lanes at least a few times a week. In fact, they were so serious about bowling that they'd even hired a coach who they met with for weekly lessons. But for tonight, they were just here to meet with their friends for a couple of casual rounds. Karen and Jim parked the car, walked inside, and went straight to their usual lane. A bunch of their bowling friends were already sitting around tables nearby, and when they saw Karen and Jim, they got up and hugged and said hello. At some point, Karen sat down, put on her bowling shoes, and took several expensive rings off her fingers and stuck them in her pocket so they wouldn't get damaged. Then she got up and got ready to play. Throughout the evening, Jim kept the table stocked with snacks and drinks for the whole group. They ate, they drank, they played, and they talked with their friends. And by the time they were all done, Karen was exhausted. She put her rings back on, changed her shoes, and all she could think about was getting home and going to bed. So she and Jim said goodbye to everyone, then they went outside, hopped in their car, and headed home. About 10 minutes later, they pulled into their driveway. They lived in a big brick house in a rural area north of town, so the neighborhood was quiet and scenic. Karen got out of the car and was about to walk to the door, but she stopped when she heard a voice call out to her from behind her. She turned around and she gasped. Four days later, around 9 a.m. on Monday, March 13th, Karen's son, Jeremy, pulled up outside his mother and stepfather's house. He parked his red sedan, then got out and walked towards the front door. So normally, at this time, Jeremy would be opening up the family store, D&D Sales. But he'd asked another person to keep an eye on the store because he needed to go see his mom. He had a routine of calling her every morning when he got to work. But that morning, when he'd called, she hadn't picked up, which was unusual. And then Jeremy realized that he actually hadn't spoken to his mother that entire weekend. And normally, they spoke just about every day. So the whole situation made him feel confused and sort of concerned. Jeremy went to the front door and he knocked, but he didn't hear anything inside. Nobody came to the door, and he called out for his mom, but he didn't hear anybody calling him back. So eventually, he reached down and tried the handle, and he discovered it was unlocked. And when he swung the door open, nothing happened, which was also unusual. Jeremy knew his mom and stepdad never left their door unlocked, and they also had an alarm system. So the alarm at this point should have been going off right now, but it wasn't. Once Jeremy was inside, he looked over at the living room, and he saw it had been completely ransacked. Furniture was overturned, and papers and random items were scattered all over the floor. At this point, Jeremy's heart was racing because obviously something was wrong. Instinctively, he just ran down the hallway to his mother and stepfather's bedroom, but when he got there, something inside of him told him not to go all the way into the room. Instead, he sort of peered around the doorframe to barely look inside, and when he did, he saw it was a mess, just like the living room. Drawers had been pulled open, and there were clothes and empty jewelry boxes all over the floor, but also on the floor, in the middle of this mess, Jeremy saw a big red puddle that he immediately knew was blood. And in this puddle, he saw 2 feet. And even though from his vantage point, peering into this room barely, Jeremy couldn't really see anything except those 2 feet, he just had this immediate gut feeling that the feet belonged to his mother and that she had been murdered. Jeremy turned, sprinted out of the house, and called the police. A few minutes later, a young, stocky detective named Scott Jones arrived on the scene, along with several other police officers and a team of forensic investigators. There were so many first responder vehicles crowded around the area that he had to park a squad car a little ways down the road. Detective Jones got out of his car and began walking towards the big brick house he was here to investigate. He had worked for the county sheriff's office for about 4 years, and in that time, he had investigated homicide cases. And he knew how important it was to approach every crime scene with a very open mind, so he was coming in with zero preconceived notions. All he knew at this point was that a few minutes ago, a young man named Jeremy had called in to report the murder of his mother, Karen Divalbliss. He also knew that the big brick house belonged to Karen and her husband Jim. But right now, Detective Jones didn't know where Jim was. Jeremy hadn't said anything about him when he'd called in the report. As Detective Jones walked, he noticed that in the midst of all the emergency response vehicles, there was also a civilian car parked on the road. It was a red sedan, and there was a thin man with dark hair and earrings sitting inside of it. Detective Jones assumed it must be Jeremy. Detective Jones took note of this and just continued towards the home's driveway. There, he met up with a slightly older detective with a handlebar mustache, whose name was Andy Roberts. Detective Jones and Detective Roberts shook hands, and then, together, they approached the front door. Detective Jones noticed that the door did not look damaged at all, like it had not been pried or broken open. In fact, there were no signs of forced entry anywhere. To Detective Jones, this meant that whoever killed Karen either had a key to the house or Karen had let them inside. And so this suggested that she had some kind of personal relationship with her killer. Still, Detective Jones reminded himself not to jump to any conclusions. He and the other detective went inside and right away saw the living room had been totally ransacked. It looked like a robbery. But again, Jones didn't want to form an opinion before seeing all the evidence. Because the house was so big, the detectives agreed to split up and examine rooms of the house separately. Detective Jones took the bedroom, where he already knew was where the body was located. And when he got there, he saw the room was a total disaster, just like the living room, and on the floor, he saw Karen Divalbliss, lying face down in a pool of blood. The detective could see her body was covered in dozens of stab wounds, and when Jones leaned down for a better look, he saw that she also had cuts all over her hands. This told the detective 2 things. First, whoever killed Karen did so in a particularly violent and aggressive way, which suggested they were extremely upset with her. And the defensive wounds on Karen's hands suggested that she very likely fought back against her attacker. And so at this point, Detective Jones began to wonder about Jim, Karen's husband. He knew that, statistically, women were most likely to be killed by their intimate partners. So it seemed possible that Jim might have murdered Karen, then staged the house to look like it had been robbed, and then he fled. Detective Jones began asking the crime scene techs to take photos of Karen's body, as well as the empty jewelry boxes all around the room. And as he was doing this, suddenly, he heard Detective Roberts call out to him from a different part of the house. He sounded startled, and he yelled for Detective Jones to hurry. Seconds later, Detective Jones was standing by Roberts as they both stared down a set of stairs into the basement. And lying at the bottom of those stairs, they could see there was a second body. When they went down the stairs, the detective saw that the body belonged to a man. He was on his back, and he had also been stabbed dozens of times. And he was just around the corner from a closet which had an empty, open safe inside of it. Detective Jones realized that they had just found Karen Divalbliss's husband, Jim. And so this made his earlier idea that maybe Jim had killed his wife Karen seem highly unlikely. And even though he still didn't want to jump to conclusions, a theory was already beginning to take shape in his mind. Based on the missing jewelry, the open safe, and the ransacked home, this was most likely a real robbery that had gone horribly wrong. But Detective Jones was hung up on one detail. There was no evidence of forced entry into the house. So, the perpetrator either had access to the home, possibly with a key, or Karen or Jim had opened the door for their killer. After he was done investigating the crime scene, Detective Jones went outside to speak to the 911 caller, who was sitting inside of his car. The man, who appeared very shaken, confirmed that his name was Jeremy Moore and that the woman inside was his mother. Detective Jones informed Jeremy that his stepfather, Jim, was also found dead inside of the home. And when Jeremy heard this, he just went silent and kind of stared off into space. Detective Jones couldn't tell if he was shocked or just pretending to be. So, he asked Jeremy why he'd come to his parents' house that day. Jeremy said that when he'd gone into work that morning, he had called his mother to check in, like he always did, but she hadn't answered. He also said the last time he had seen his mom was 4 days earlier, on Thursday evening, when she and Jim had stopped by the hobby store on their way to go bowling at Tiki Lanes. Detective Jones then asked Jeremy about the contents of the house and what might have been taken. Jeremy told him that his mother did have a lot of jewelry, but he didn't know where she kept it all. And he also said he had no idea who would have done something like this. Detective Jones knew that it was way too soon to confirm or eliminate Jeremy as a suspect. He also didn't know when the couple had died, so he couldn't determine if Jeremy had an alibi yet. So for now, he told Jeremy he was free to go. Detective Jones watched Jeremy drive away, then he went back to the driveway to speak with Detective Roberts. They both agreed to keep an eye on Jeremy, but they also wanted to send a team of investigators to speak to neighbors and ask if anybody had seen or heard anything strange over the last few days. And while they did that, Jones decided he would go check out the bowling alley that Jeremy had mentioned. Later that day, Detective Jones walked inside of Tiki Lanes. He hoped the staff there would have some information for him, because so far, the investigative team had not gotten much from Karen and Jim's neighbors. Everyone they had spoken to had said they hadn't seen or heard anything weird, and they also hadn't seen Karen or Jim all weekend. Detective Jones went up to the front desk and explained why he was there, and a few of the employees said that they did know Karen and Jim, and they agreed to sit down with the detective and answer his questions. From these interviews, Detective Jones learned that Karen and Jim were regulars at Tiki Lanes, and they were avid bowlers who'd hired a coach to improve their game. He also found out that Karen typically wore a lot of rings on her fingers, which was actually pretty significant to him, because she wasn't wearing any rings when she was found. Whoever had killed her very likely had taken them right off her hands. Lastly, everyone Detective Jones spoke to at the bowling alley said that the last time they'd seen the couple was Thursday night. That was also the last time that Jeremy reported seeing them as well. So for now, Detective Jones decided to operate under the assumption that Karen and Jim had been killed Thursday, sometime after they had bowled at Tiki Lanes. And so based on that, he decided to call Jeremy in for a formal interview to ask him what he had done after he had left work on Thursday evening. The next day, Detective Jones sat in front of his computer inside of his office at the police station while he waited for Jeremy to show up for his interview. He was preparing for the interview by doing some research about Jeremy. Based on interviews the rest of the investigative team had done with Karen and Jim's friends, neighbors, and family members, Detective Jones had already learned a couple of very interesting things. First, Jeremy had reportedly stolen money and other items from Karen in the past. Second, Jeremy was in Karen's will and was going to inherit a lot of money now that she was dead. In the detective's mind, this seemed like a pretty clear motive for murder. It also struck him as very suspicious that Jeremy had been the one who found Karen's body and called the police. Detective Jones knew that it wasn't uncommon for murderers to return to the scene of a crime and to literally insert themselves into the investigation. Now, on his computer, Detective Jones pulled up Jeremy's criminal record and scanned through his previous charges. He saw that Jeremy had been arrested for theft. Now, the detective knew there was a big difference between stealing and committing murder, but the fact that Jeremy had a documented history of theft and the fact that he was going to inherit a lot of money after his mother died looked really bad for him. So, when Jeremy finally came in for his interview, Detective Jones was very eager to talk to him. He led Jeremy into an interview room and then sat down across from him. And just like the last time they had spoken, Jeremy struck the detective as seeming nervous and emotional. Detective Jones started by asking Jeremy what he had done on Thursday evening, after he'd gotten off from work. And Jeremy said he'd gone straight home. But when Detective Jones asked if anybody could verify that, Jeremy said no one could. So, Detective Jones began pressing him much harder, asking him directly about his history of theft and also his mother's will. Jeremy admitted that he had made some mistakes in the past, but he swore he would never hurt his mother, whether he was in her will or not. He said this whole thing was just as confusing and upsetting for him as it was for everybody else. Now, Detective Jones wasn't sure if he actually believed Jeremy, But he still didn't have any evidence that would allow him to hold Jeremy in custody, so he let Jeremy go. And then once he was gone, the detective began heading back to his office. But on the way there, he ran into his partner, Detective Roberts, who looked excited. Roberts said he'd been going over statements the rest of the investigative team had collected from Karen's siblings, and there was someone that they really needed to speak to. A little while later, Detective Jones listened outside the door of an interrogation room as another detective was sitting with Karen's former sister-in-law, Deanna Smith. Karen's brother, Edgar, had told police about Deanna, who was his ex-wife. Edgar said that Karen had bought him and Deanna a house in Lancaster where they lived with their 2 kids. But when Edgar and Deanna got divorced, Edgar moved out, but Deanna wanted to stay inside of the house. Now, Deanna didn't have a lot of money after the divorce, so Karen had made an agreement with her. She could stay in the house if she paid a small fee each month and then also came to Karen's house weekly and cleaned it. It seemed like a win-win situation, but Deanna almost never showed up to clean Karen's house like she had promised. So eventually, as a result of that, Karen increased her rent, and this had made Deanna really mad and led to a lot of tension between them. And when investigators had spoken to Karen's other siblings, they'd also learned that Deanna loved jewelry and expensive things, even though she really couldn't afford them. So, investigators had brought Deanna in for an interview because someone who loved jewelry and disliked Karen was incredibly suspicious. Plus, if Deanna did periodically clean Karen's house, well, she might have had a key or known the alarm system's security code, which could explain why there was no evidence of forced entry. And so now, Detective Jones stood there in the hallway and listened in. When the investigator in the room asked Deanna about the rent increase and her cleaning arrangement with Karen, Deanna said she didn't have any issues with Karen, which obviously was not true. Deanna also said she did not have a key to Karen's house or know the code to their alarm, which seemed hard to believe if she was supposed to drop by weekly to their house to clean it. It just seemed like Deanna was not being honest. But right now, it was Deanna's word against the rest of Karen's siblings, so police really couldn't hold her. Still, after she had left, Detective Jones kept thinking about the fact that Karen's siblings had really specifically mentioned that Deanna truly loved jewelry. And so if Deanna had stolen Karen's jewelry, she might have kept it, but she also might have pawned it since she needed the money. At this point, the investigative team already knew that Karen had a lot of expensive and unique pieces of jewelry that she typically bought at a specific local store. Authorities were already in touch with the shop owner, who was confident that she would actually recognize most of Karen's items. So, Detective Jones decided to start contacting pawn shops in Lancaster and the surrounding areas to see what jewelry had been sold between last Thursday and now. If any of it turned out to be Karen's, they might be able to find out exactly who had pawned it. On Wednesday, March 15th, 2006, so 2 days after Karen and Jim had been found dead, Detective Jones was at his desk when one of his investigators came in and dropped an itemized receipt in front of him. It was from a local pawn shop and was for the sale of an expensive piece of jewelry on Saturday, March 11th, just 2 days after Karen and Jim were killed. And when Detective Jones looked at the bottom of the paper, he gasped. The seller's name was written right there. It was Deanna Smith, Karen's former sister-in-law. Detective Jones felt his heart pounding, but he tried to tell himself to be patient. Before they did anything else, they needed to be absolutely sure that the piece of jewelry Deanna sold actually belonged to Karen. So he told the officers to get the jewelry from the pawn shop, and the next day, Karen's regular jeweler came into the station to look at it, and she determined, beyond a doubt, that it was not Karen's. After the jeweler left, Detective Jones slumped in his desk chair and rubbed his eyes in frustration. Now, the fact that this pawn jewelry did not belong to Karen was definitely disappointing, but the detective also didn't think that that proved Deanna was innocent. She clearly needed money, otherwise why would she have pawned one of her own pieces? And they also had a lot of other clues that made her seem suspicious as well. Still, at this point, Detective Jones didn't really know where to turn. A whole team of detectives was investigating the case, but it felt like they just kept hitting dead end after dead end. He was still sure the motivation in this case had to be money. Karen and Jim's house had been ransacked, and a lot of their valuables were missing, like Karen's jewelry. Even the ring she had on her hands had been taken. But the robbery didn't seem random. It had been targeted and deliberate. The killer had been able to access the house without breaking in, which meant they either had a key or Karen and Jim had let them in. And not only that, the couple was killed with such violence, it seemed like the killer was deeply angry with them. And there were two people who had a financial motive and potential access to the home: Karen's son, Jeremy, and her ex-sister-in-law, Deanna. But Detective Jones hadn't found any concrete evidence to prove that Jeremy or Deanna had committed this crime. And as he sat there going over the case in his mind, he knew there were a lot of other people in Karen and Jim's lives that the police had barely even looked into yet. They had friends from the bowling alley, plus multiple employees, tenants, and neighbors that interacted with them regularly. And these people knew Jim and Karen were wealthy. And so basically, Karen and Jim seemed to have some kind of relationship with pretty much everybody in Lancaster. And so Detective Jones had a whole lot more interviewing still left to do. About a week later, so 11 days after Karen and Jim's bodies were found, Detective Jones was sitting in his office feeling frustrated. His team had been going all over town, interviewing basically everybody in Lancaster, and still they had not gotten a single helpful tip. But that afternoon, Detective Jones's phone rang, and the best lead he'd gotten so far seemed to fall right into his lap. It was somebody from his department calling with a very interesting story. They said they'd just gotten a call from a guy who worked at a moving company in town. The employee said that a customer had come in, rented a truck, and paid him in cash a few days ago. And the employee said he had just begun counting their cash payment, and he'd found something the police really needed to see. Detective Jones hung up the phone, grabbed his coat, and headed out to meet this guy. Before long, Detective Jones stood at an office counter across from the moving company employee, and they both were looking down at the cash the employee had mentioned on the phone call. And as Detective Jones was looking at it, he asked the employee to tell him everything he could remember about the person who had given him the cash. And the employee told him that a few days ago, he'd gotten to work early to set up for the day, but when he arrived, there were already some customers lined up by the door. And one of them had been carrying a heavy-looking plastic grocery bag and seemed very antsy to get inside. And they told the employee that they really needed to rent a truck for a move. The employee noticed that the customer looked exhausted and sort of scared. But the weirdest part about this whole encounter was that when it came time for the customer to pay for the rental, they'd opened up their shopping bag and it was full of what looked like thousands of dollars in loose bills. It was definitely weird, but money was money, so the employee had accepted the cash and handed the customer the keys, and they'd gone on their way. It was not until later, when the employee had counted the cash from the sale, that he noticed a lot of the money was covered in blood. Detective Jones couldn't believe it. He asked the employee if he kept records of his customers' names and information. The employee walked over to a file cabinet, pulled out a particular piece of paper, and handed it to Detective Jones. It was a contract that all customers had to sign in order to rent a moving truck. And written on that contract was a name and an address. Detective Jones rushed back to the station and pored over the evidence once again. He wanted to make sure that every piece of information they had lined up with the person whose name was on that contract. And as far as he could see, it did. So he and Detective Roberts, along with some backup, went to the address the moving company had given them. And when they got there, they saw it was a mobile home. They charged up to the door and loudly announced themselves. Seconds later, the door opened, and the detectives saw not one, but two people standing in the doorway. And when Detective Jones looked behind these people into the mobile home, he knew immediately that these were the people who had killed Karen and Jim Divalbliss. Based on later confessions and evidence collected by investigators, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Karen and Jim Divalbliss on March 9th, 2006. That evening, the killer was riding in the back seat of a car with a few other people. In one hand, they were holding a plastic grocery bag, and in their other hand, they were clutching a large kitchen knife. They were on their way to Karen and Jim's house. The killer had been planning to rob the couple for a while now. They'd even asked an accomplice to join them. And now, one of their friends was driving them and their accomplice to the house. But as they got closer to the big brick home, the killer saw that all the lights were off and there was no car in the driveway. Karen and Jim weren't home. And this was actually a big problem. The killer needed Karen and Jim to be home because they had an alarm system that would go off if the killer tried to break in. The killer also needed Jim and Karen around to open up their safe, which they knew was in the basement. And so now, since they weren't home, the killer decided the plan wouldn't work and they should just forget about it. So they told their friend who was driving to turn around. But as they began to drive away, they saw Karen and Jim pass them on the road, headed towards their house. At this point, the killer realized they could still go through with their plan. So they told the driver to turn around again. And a few moments later, they pulled up in front of the house, and the killer and the accomplice jumped out right as Karen and Jim were walking up their driveway. The killer called out to the couple, and when they turned around, the killer held up the knife. They told Karen and Jim to let them and their accomplice inside the house, or else. Karen and Jim were obviously terrified, so they did what the killer said. They went inside, and then the killer led Jim downstairs to the safe, while the accomplice stayed upstairs and kept an eye on Karen. When the killer and Jim got to the safe, the killer held up the knife again and told Jim to open it. Jim did, and then the killer grabbed all the money that was inside and began shoving it into the grocery bag. But at some point, Jim tried to get away, and the killer knew they couldn't let him, or they'd be caught in the middle of this robbery. So they didn't stop to think. They just started stabbing Jim over and over until he stopped moving. After that, the killer calmly walked upstairs where they found Karen and the accomplice, and they demanded that Karen show them where she kept her jewelry. When Karen said it was in her bedroom, the killer brought her in there. But at some point, Karen began to struggle with the killer and was knocked to the floor. And after that, the accomplice held on to Karen as the killer stabbed her over and over again. Karen did try to fight back, but it was too much, and eventually she also died. The killer and their accomplice spent the next hour raiding the home for valuables. When they got all they could carry, they ran back to the car waiting outside and fled with thousands and thousands of dollars in cash, jewelry, and antiques. The killer was not Karen's former sister-in-law, Deanna, and it wasn't Karen's son, Jeremy. It was somebody else who did regularly work for the couple, and who'd recently had an argument with them over how much money they were owed. The killer was Karen and Jim's handyman, 26-year-old Eric Hockman. Eric had done a lot of odd jobs for the couple, including recently painting their store's sign. But when Karen paid him for that work, Eric felt like she had given him less than he was owed. And this infuriated him, because he knew that Karen and Jim had a ton of money. And also, they had a lot of expensive things, and he knew this because he had done work at their house and seen these things. So, he started planning a robbery. He asked a friend to give him a ride, and then also enlisted his girlfriend, 29-year-old Heidi Kidwell, to be his accomplice. The friend agreed, and also Heidi agreed, possibly because she was in the middle of a 3-week heroin high and was not thinking clearly. After the murders, Eric and Heidi laid low for a few days. Then, about 3 days after Karen and Jim's bodies were found, they rented a moving truck and left town. But their big mistake was paying for their rental with cash they had stolen from Karen and Jim, cash that was covered in the couple's blood. The moving company employee led the police straight to Eric and Heidi's new address, which was over 1,000 miles away in Key Largo, Florida. When authorities searched Eric and Heidi's mobile home there, they found thousands of dollars in cash, along with expensive antiques, watches, and jewelry that was later identified as belonging to Karen. Eric and Heidi were both arrested and taken back to Ohio. Heidi pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Eric was convicted of 2 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He also received 67 additional years for kidnapping, aggravated burglary, tampering with evidence, and theft from an elderly person. The person who drove Eric and Heidi to commit the murders was never charged. Eric would die by suicide in jail in 2019. Heidi was released from prison in 2020 and passed away 2 years later at age 45. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch. Story editing by Karis Pash Cooper. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the MrBallen Podcast, as well as MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to tell you two stories about people who wanted to do something very impressive and came up with a pretty ambitious plan to do it. But they overlooked one crucial detail that became the difference between life and death. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to take the follow button out on a whale watching cruise. But once you're out on the water, just throw them overboard and leave. Okay, let's get into our first story, which is called Birthday Surprise. On the night of August 25th, 2011, a 23-year-old woman named Risa Demura, along with her husband, Hiroki Demura, were sitting on their couch in their apartment in Kanazawa City, Japan, watching TV. And as they sat there, they both found themselves laughing hysterically at the screen. They were watching their favorite show. It was this hidden camera comedy prank show, and this was like the highlight of their day, sitting here together on the couch and just laughing their heads off. Risa and Hiroki had been married for just 4 months, and so they were still very much living in that newlywed bliss period, where they basically spent every second they could together. When Hiroki wasn't working, the two of them would go out to eat, they would go to the movies together, or take trips to the beach, since Kanazawa City was right on the coast. And whenever they were out, they were always talking about how lucky they felt, that they had found each other, and that they were married, and that the rest of their lives were going to look like this. Like, how lucky were they? Risa and Hiroki had actually met when they were young kids in middle school, but Hiroki was very shy and really didn't speak to Risa at all at the time. But then later, as adults after college, they ran into each other, and Hiroki, he told Risa the truth, that he actually had always loved her, and he still did. And Risa really had been shocked by this because she had always felt a type of way about him, but it really didn't seem like he was interested in her. So this was like this amazing revelation. But more than that, it was also just incredibly romantic to her, like a classic Hollywood love story. And so when he had confessed his love to her, she had pretty much immediately said, "Oh my gosh, let's go on a date. This is awesome. Let's do it." And from there, it had just been a whirlwind. You know, they had just fallen completely in love. And then within the year, they had gotten married. Now, the reason they had ultimately settled in Kanazawa City was mostly just because of Hiroki's job. He worked at a company that was in the city. And he was also kind of a rising star there. Every time Risa met one of his coworkers, they would talk about how, he was such a hard worker and what a natural-born leader he was. And so Risa was very proud of him. But more than that, she felt inspired by Hiroki. And so she found herself wanting to find a really fulfilling job herself. And so she was on the hunt for, her career. But for right now, Risa was very much still in the sort of identifying what she wanted to do phase. And it was because she was just kind of always going from one interest to another because she just had this huge, insatiable curiosity and loved trying new things, which made it hard to choose just one thing to do with her life. But Hiroki was incredibly supportive of this. I mean, he treated Risa like she was royalty, and he always said that whatever she wanted to do was completely fine by him as long as she was happy. But for right now, as Risa sat on the couch next to Hiroki watching this funny show, she found her mind wandering away from the show and away from her ongoing job search to Hiroki's birthday. It was coming up, and she just felt like there was a lot of pressure on her to do something really special for him. Mostly because Hiroki always did something really thoughtful and really incredible for her. Like, he really celebrated her really well. And she didn't want to kind of underwhelm him. And this was also going to be the first time one of them was having a birthday now that they were officially married. So Risa really wanted to go all out and plan something really great that Hiroki would never forget. But as Risa sat on the couch next to her husband trying to come up with the perfect birthday celebration idea, she just kept drawing a blank. It's like the only thing she could think of that really she and her husband shared was they both were very romantic people. And so this would have to be romantic in some way, but how, she didn't know. And in many ways, she and her husband were very different in how they showed affection or how they showed romance. Hiroki was still a very quiet and reserved person, so his displays of affection to his wife were reserved and private. But Risa, on the other hand, was massively extroverted, full of energy, and so her displays of affection were sort of over the top and big and boisterous. And so Risa is just really struggling, trying to think, like, how can I do this? And it was like all of a sudden she has this epiphany and she sees in her mind's eye the perfect way to celebrate his birthday. She didn't even know what inspired it, but it came to her. She would take her husband out on a very romantic beach walk, but then at the end of the beach walk, there would be this surprise over-the-top fireworks display. It was exactly what she needed. It was romantic and crazy, just like her. 2 days later, on Saturday afternoon, Risa, along with 6 of her friends, were at Osaki Beach, which is the beach where the big birthday was going to take place, and the birthday was going to be that night. But now that Risa had planned out the big party, she had done that the day before while Hiroki was at work, now on the day of, she actually had some physical setup to do, because this was not just going to be a walk on the beach, there was also going to be fireworks, and so she needed her friends for that. And so what they were doing on this day is they were walking along the beach looking for the perfect spot that would afford Risa and her husband some privacy on the beach, so it was very romantic, but also had like a vantage point for the friends where they could basically hide and watch the couple and look for the signal to then light off the fireworks when it was the right time. And so Risa and her friends, they're walking along the beach and then they see it. There's this kind of private, sort of secluded section of the beach that had this row of shrubbery kind of lining the backside of it that would be a perfect spot for the friends to hide. And then also down on the beach, it'd be nice and private and peaceful. And they thought that was the best spot to have this big party. And so over there they go, the friends go up into the bushes and they get their fireworks ready. And then Risa, she went down to the sand section of the beach and she kind of prepped the area where she and Hiroki would be. And then ultimately she laid out this blue sheet. And then once that was in place, she walked back up to her friends and they said, okay, we're ready to go. And so Risa told her friends her plan was to be there that night at 10 p.m. with her husband, and that the friends should actually get there a little bit earlier to be all set up. And they agreed, and then they all left. As Risa left the beach, she found herself feeling incredibly antsy. I mean, she was so excited about this big surprise party that night, and she just wanted it to be 10 p.m. so she could finally reveal what she had in store for Hiroki. But she also knew she couldn't give away that she had this big surprise. And so when she got home, where Hiroki was, she acted like everything was totally normal. And so when she walked inside, she quickly sent Hiroki to the couch to go relax, while she made them both a very nice dinner. And then when she was done, the two of them sat down at the table, and Risa kind of pretended like she had nothing planned, and she was like, hey, what should we do this weekend to celebrate your birthday? And they talked about, going and seeing friends and, going out, whatever they were going to do, but it was all a big ruse. Risa had her big plan for the night. And then at some point, when it was getting kind of late, and it seemed like Hiroki was maybe thinking about going to bed, Risa said, well, wait a minute, it's your birthday weekend. Let's not go to bed right now. Let's go on a beach walk. What a great idea that would be. And Hiroki was kind of surprised, but he's like, actually, yeah, that sounds great. Let's go for it. And as soon as he said that, Risa could barely contain her excitement because she knew she had this awesome thing planned for him down at the beach, and it was about to happen. Like, this was going to be awesome. And so she and her husband quickly cleaned up, and then just before 10 p.m., they left their apartment and got in the car and headed to the beach. About 10 minutes later, they parked at the end of this dead-end road right near the beach. And when they got out, there was basically bushes on all sides of the road, but there was this little path that cut through the bushes that led down to the sand. But as Risa led Hiroki down this path, she quickly realized she had a big problem. There was virtually no moonlight. It's like basically pitch black on the beach. And remember, she had put out that blue blanket to signify where she and Hiroki would be, in position so that her friends who were nearby in the bushes could light off the fireworks. It was all contingent on getting to that blue blanket. And it's so dark that not only was Risa unable to see this blue blanket, certainly not from a distance, but she could barely see the sand. It's so dark, it's like eerie out on the beach. And this is in 2011 when you couldn't just pull out your cell phone and turn on your flashlight. There was no flashlight feature. And so the best they could do was basically pull out their phone, tap on the screen, and use the little bit of light coming from that to guide their way. But after walking on the beach just a short ways, Hiroki actually stopped Risa and said, hey, I don't think it's safe to be walking on the beach. We really can't see where we're going. Let's go back and get a flashlight. But Risa knows her friends are already in position in those shrubs down the beach, ready to light off those fireworks, and they likely can't see very well. And so she's worried that if she doesn't get there soon, that somehow her friends are going to panic and light off the fireworks prematurely. She doesn't know what's going to happen here, but she's starting to get worried that everything's falling apart and she can't afford to be late. And so she tells her husband, no, let's not go back and get flashlights. Let's just walk on the dark sand. It's no big deal. And so the two of them are walking along the beach using their cell phone screens to guide them. But pretty quickly, Hiroki started to notice that Risa seemed really anxious and was walking really too fast. This is meant to be a peaceful walk on the beach, and Risa is like a woman on a mission here, trying to go somewhere, but he doesn't understand where she's trying to go. She's just walking really quickly ahead of him. And finally, he said to her, hey, what's going on? Why are you trying to walk so quickly? What are we doing out here? And so finally, she just stops. And she looks at her husband, and she's about to tell him what's actually going on because she feels like, the surprise at this point is ruined, and she basically needs his help if they're going to find this blanket and figure out where they need to be. But right as Risa is about to tell her husband what's going on, suddenly it was like the whole world went completely black. No more ambient light from cell phones, no more minimal moonlight, nothing. Absolute blackness and silence. At the same time, Risa's friends were actually not that far away up in the bushes. But much like Risa and Hiroki, they had also been dealing with the issue that they basically couldn't see anything. It was so dark. And so they got in position, but they basically couldn't even see the sand. They had no idea if Risa and Hiroki were in position or not, but they could hear Risa and Hiroki talking. They could hear them sort of out there somewhere on the sand. And the friends were kind of whispering back and forth, how are we going to know when they're actually in position to light off the fireworks? How are we going to get the signal? We can't see them. And so the friends are sort of unsure what to do, and they're straining their eyes out onto the sand, trying to see Risa, trying to see Hiroki, but again, they can't see them. They can't see the blue blanket, even though it's not that far away. And so they're just looking and listening, and they can kind of tell that Risa and Hiroki are probably the voices they're hearing, and they appear to be moving in this direction. But then suddenly they start hearing these screams coming from the same direction they were hearing voices that they believed were their friends. And at first they thought the screams might actually be the signal, light off the fireworks. But the screams, they sounded like somebody was in trouble. And critically, as soon as the screaming started, it abruptly stopped. It was high-pitched, just awful screams, and then silence. Absolute total silence on the beach. And again, they can't see anything. So they don't know what's going on. They don't even know if that's actually Risa and Hiroki, but they think something's wrong here. So they abandon the fireworks, they leave their hiding spot, and they charge out onto the beach, and they're looking all around, but they really can't see anything. They can't even find the the blue blanket, and they knew roughly where it was. They couldn't even find that. And so they're running around the beach, they're calling out to Hiroki and to Risa, but they're not hearing anything back. And for 30 minutes, they're just running around looking for their friends, just knowing like something bad has happened here. And then at some point, one of the friends doubles back and they go roughly to the area where, Risa and Hiroki were supposed to be, near that blue blanket, and they make a discovery. It would turn out, when Risa and Hiroki were out on that beach walking around in the darkness, Risa actually did find that blue sheet that she'd set up in preparation for this big birthday surprise. Except it was so dark that even though they were literally at this point standing on the blanket, she and Hiroki couldn't tell it was that dark. Now, that doesn't seem like that would be catastrophic until you consider what was underneath that blanket. So 2 days earlier, when Risa had that epiphany of how she could have the best birthday ever for Hiroki, she had had that epiphany in part because of the show they were watching on TV, the hidden camera comedy show that she and Hiroki both loved. The show was called Arashi's Big Secret, and its comedy really came from the over-the-top pranks that the show's hosts would pull on Japanese celebrities. And one of those pranks was to dig a large hole on the beach that somebody would accidentally fall into. And so Risa thought, what a great idea. What if I dig a hole on the beach, cover it up, and then after our romantic walk on the beach for his birthday, I'll have Hiroki fall into the hole, and then my friends will fire off those fireworks, and it'll be sort of like he's on the game show that we love so much. It'll basically be like a combination of a romantic, fun time on the beach and a prank and a big birthday celebration afterwards. It was perfect. However, Risa made a terrible miscalculation. So on the game show, when they would dig these holes in the beach, they would cover them with basically dried foam, like think styrofoam, that the instant one of their contestants or their celebrities stepped directly on the foam would break and they would fall feet first into the hole. What Risa did is after she dug this deep hole along with her friends, getting ready for this big party, she covered the hole first with a thick piece of plastic, like almost like plywood, but plastic, like rigid plastic. And so she covered the hole with that. That was like the platform. And then she covered that with the blue sheet so that to the naked eye, it looked like the ground was level underneath the blue sheet. In Risa's mind, this rigid plastic would break the instant her husband stepped on it. Like it wasn't that strong. It was maybe strong enough to hold him for a second, but it would definitely snap in the middle and he would fall in, just like on the game show. But in reality, when she and her husband inadvertently walked onto that blue sheet without realizing it because it was so dark, that piece of plastic didn't break. It was too rigid. The plastic, instead of breaking, just kind of tilted suddenly to one side, causing Risa and her husband to suddenly tumble basically forward, both of them, head first into this hole, and caused this massive avalanche of sand to come into the hole and completely cover the two of them up. And so Risa and Hiroki, they screamed for a second as they began to fall into the ground, and then suddenly they're upside down and completely covered all the way to the top by heavy, wet sand. That's why it went silent after the screams, because they were completely buried alive. Risa's friends ultimately, after walking around the beach after hearing those screams, they would find the blue blanket, and it was partially submerged in the sand. And so they really didn't know what had happened, but because of the screams and what they were seeing, they just called the authorities. And they came out to the beach, and it would take them like 30 minutes to finally dig out Risa and Hiroki from this hole. But by that point, it was too late. They both had suffocated to death. The next and final story of today's episode is called Excellent. One morning in the winter of 1856, a 27-year-old explorer named Dr. Edward Fogel sat down for breakfast at the home where he was staying in the city of Abashir, which was in a kingdom called Wadai in Central Africa. Edward poured himself a cup of milk, and then, even though the table was full of warm breads and cakes and porridge, Edward called a servant over and asked her to get him a plate of boiled eggs. But the servant just apologized and said, "I'm sorry, but we don't have any eggs this morning. We're all out." Edward was disappointed, but, he thanked the servant anyways. So Edward was visiting Africa from Germany on a map-making expedition, and he'd been there for the past 2 weeks. And so far, all the local food really upset his stomach, except for eggs. So for literally every single meal, the only thing he ate was eggs. And now, because they were out of eggs, despite there being all this other food to choose from, he knew he couldn't eat it without getting sick, and so he would just have to go hungry. But outside of the food, overall, Edward thought the city of Abashir was okay. He had gotten to meet the king, who had arranged for him to stay here in this very nice home that was owned by a noble family. And the area itself was extremely beautiful. And Edward was actually going to be the very first European to successfully make a map of it, which meant that he'd be essentially creating history. But Edward just really was not getting along with the locals. They just seemed kind of overall pretty suspicious of him. And, Edward couldn't believe it, but they didn't seem to care at all that he was this famous map maker who had come all the way there from Germany to literally put their kind of insignificant city onto the map of the whole world. Like, why didn't they appreciate that? He couldn't believe it. And now, adding insult to injury, Edward also couldn't even eat any breakfast. And so, feeling pretty annoyed, despite all the effort clearly people had made to feed him that morning, Edward stood up from the table and he left to go spend the day exploring. He walked into the front courtyard, where another servant was waiting with Edward's horse. Edward spent most of his days in the city just kind of riding around and drawing maps of streets and alleyways. But today, this servant warned Edward that he really ought to stay inside, because it was not safe for him to go out into the city. So at this point in time, the kingdom that Abashir was a part of was at war with several nations. And so as a result, everybody in the city was very worried about spies, which meant they were very suspicious of foreigners, like Edward. Now, for the most part, locals had sort of put up with his presence so far, but to them, it just sort of seemed like he was always watching them without ever talking to anyone, and so they had started to gossip. But Edward, after being given this warning by the servant, did not take it seriously. Instead, he kind of scoffed and said, it's no big deal. Like, I'm not going to be out there for very long anyways. Nothing's going to happen. He said he had another plan for today. His big plan was he would leave the city of Abashir and he would go to this nearby mountain, and he wanted to climb up it and get a bird's eye view of the city from the mountaintop to help him finish up his map. But when Edward said that, the servant looked truly horrified and told Edward that he simply could not do that, because the mountain Edward was clearly talking about was sacred, and nobody was allowed to climb it. Like, that was really important to the people who lived here. But to Edward, this warning really did not land. Instead, he just looked at it as more evidence that the locals just didn't appreciate what he was doing for them. Like, he was on a very important mission that was far more important than anything sacred to them. And so Edward, he thanked the servant for his warning, but also said, look, I'm going to do what I'm going to do because this is really important, and so I'm going to go hike that mountain, and I'll see you tonight when I drop off the horse. And then Edward climbed onto the horse, and he rode off. But Edward didn't come back. He didn't come back that night, or the day after, or the day after, and pretty soon it was clear that Edward was missing. Word of Edward's disappearance ultimately made it back to Germany pretty quickly, specifically to the Geography Society that had sent him to Africa on this map-making mission in the first place. So the Geography Society and the German public sent several search parties to Africa to go look for Edward. But despite multiple serious attempts over several years, nobody ever found him or figured out what happened to him. And because of this, Edward sort of became famous in Germany. People began to see him as this brave explorer who thirsted for knowledge and went daringly into the unknown. They imagined dramatic and tragic things that might have happened to him, like maybe he had been assassinated or taken prisoner, or maybe he discovered something holy or ancient that he wasn't supposed to see. And so in time, the story of Edward got bigger and bigger, and he became a symbol of, German pride. I mean, this was our explorer. He had done something amazing, clearly. Also, adding intrigue to this already very bizarre mystery was the fact that all the people who actually went to Africa to look for Edward, the search parties over the years, literally everybody who went died. Now, all those searchers, they know how they died. It was local violence or disease or just plain bad luck. But it sort of added intrigue to this mystery. Everybody who went looking for Edward didn't come back. That became part of the lore. And so this mystery just continued to grow and get passed around, and things were embellished and things were fictionalized until finally, almost 20 years after Edward disappeared, another explorer named Gustav Nachtigall decided he was going to be the one who finally figured out once and for all what actually happened to this guy. And so in the early winter of 1874, Gustav is now in the courtyard outside of his apartment in Abashir, because he had actually gone to Africa to begin his search for, the answer here, what happened to Edward. And he's standing in this courtyard along with his translator, whose name was Ahmed. And the two of them were sitting across from an elderly man who was friends with the current king of Abashir. And this elderly man had at one point lived in one of the apartments across the courtyard. And so Gustav asked this old man if he had ever met with a European man about 17 years earlier. And Ahmed translated the question to him. And the old man said yes, he had. That one European man had come to meet with the king around that time, and he had always been writing in this notebook, but he had never seemed to want to speak to anybody and had for the most part kept to himself. But the old man said, beyond his impression of this guy, he really didn't know anything about him. He had no idea, what he was doing or what happened to him. So at this point, both Gustav and Ahmed had been in Abashir for 2 months now. And in that time, they had been trying to ask around and see if anybody remembered Edward. And so far, they had run into a few people who seemed to remember him, like this older man, because it was pretty rare to see a European person in the city. But unfortunately, nobody had any information on how or when Edward disappeared. Or, in the rare case that they did seem to know more, they refused to talk about it. And so for Gustav, on the one hand, this was incredibly frustrating because all he wanted was just the truth here. But on the other hand, as he ran into more and more people that did seem apprehensive to talk about Edward at all, that sort of seemed to suggest that maybe something really bad did happen to Edward when he was in Abashir. And if that was the case, if some horrible fate befell him, Gustav knew there was one person in this city who almost certainly would know the truth. But Gustav basically couldn't ask this one person any questions about Edward without being incredibly offensive, because this one person was the current king of Abashir, King Ali, and it would have been his father who had met Edward and arranged for him to stay with that noble family when he was doing his map-making thing. And so for Edward to have been killed or captured, or if something horrible happened to him while he was in Abashir, well, King Ali's father would have had to have given the okay, or would have at least known about it and maybe been okay with it. He would have known something making him complicit in some way with whatever happened to Edward. And so to ask King Ali, what do you think happened to Edward? You could be potentially suggesting that his dad did something terrible. But more than that, what Ahmed had told Gustav was that you don't just risk offending the king by asking those questions. You might actually be executed for offending the king. And so what Gustav decided he needed to do here, because he was so dead set on trying to figure out this mystery, is he still needed to find a way to talk to King Ali about Edward, but without losing his life. He had to come up with a clever way to get this information out of the king. A few weeks later, and Gustav and Ahmed had still not yet come up with the clever way to speak to the king yet. They didn't have a way to approach the subject without horribly offending the king. And so the two of them were in Gustav's apartment eating lunch when suddenly there was a knock at the door. And so Gustav got up, he went to the door, and when he opened it up, it was this courier who told Gustav that he was part of a caravan that had just arrived here from North Africa, and he had some mail for Gustav from back home, so letters from Germany. And he just handed the bundle of mail to Gustav. And Gustav, who did not get mail very often, was very excited. And he said, "Oh, thank you." He took the mail, thanked the guy, shut the door, and he went back into the common room. And he just began going through the mail and just looking to see who had sent him something. And as he was doing it, he suddenly had this great idea. It had nothing to do with what was written in the letters. It was just the concept of receiving mail suddenly gave him this great way to talk to the king. The very next day, Gustav and Ahmed walked into the royal palace in Abashir. And when they walked in, they eventually made their way into this bright and airy courtroom. And in this courtroom, on the other end against the wall, was King Ali sitting on a throne. And so Gustav and Ahmed immediately go over to the king and they greet him and they exchange some pleasantries. And as they're doing that, Gustav, he knew that caravan that had come through the day before from North Africa with, Gustav's mail, had also made a stop at the palace and presented the king with all these gifts like a silver tea set and gold watches and all this luxurious fabric. And so Gustav was really hoping that those gifts had put the king in a really good mood, because that was a big part of his plan here. At some point, after, the pleasantries had stopped, Gustav actually referenced the caravan and told the king that, in fact, they had also swung by his place and dropped off this big bundle of letters from back home. And he said he was really happy about it. And the king kind of seconded that and said, oh yeah, they gave me all these great gifts. Like, yeah, it's so wonderful. And so they're kind of talking back and forth about how great this mail delivery was, when Gustav tells this incredible lie to the king. He tells the king, he goes, all those letters, it was really great to hear from home, from my friends, from my family. But there was this one really weird letter in there that I didn't even know who it was from. Now, this letter didn't exist. This was a total fabrication. But he told the king that this weird letter, it was from this elderly man who had written to Gustav to tell him that his son had gone to Abashir many years ago and not come home again. And so now the elderly man, he knew his son was probably not alive at this point. But in this letter to Gustav, this fictional letter to Gustav, he told Gustav that his son had done a lot of writing in notebooks. And he was hopeful that maybe someone in Abashir had these notebooks. And could Gustav get the notebooks and return them to the old man to give him some comfort about, what his son had been doing and saying and thinking before he disappeared. As soon as Gustav said this, he could actually feel the mood in the throne room shift, and he could tell that King Ali was very much on edge about what Gustav might say next. But Gustav had planned for this, and he told the king that, just so you know, all throughout Europe, people think of you as a wise and just king. And so if by chance you have these notebooks and you were to give them to me so I can give them to this elderly man in his old age so he can have some comfort before he dies, if you would do that, the people of Europe would love you even more for that simple act of kindness. Then Gustav went quiet, and there was really intense silence in the throne room. But then the king just kind of sat back in his throne, and he smiled at Gustav. And as soon as Gustav saw that smile on the king's face, he decided he's just got to do it. And he said to the king, "The son's name is Dr. Edward Fogel." And then after that, Gustav just went silent, because he knew at this point, if the king thought he was lying, he could easily be executed right now. But King Ali just kept on smiling at Gustav and just said, "You know what? I'll think about it." Gustav quickly thanked the king and hurried out of the throne room, and then he went back to his apartment and spent the entire night just pacing around his room, wondering what was going to happen. Part of Gustav was optimistic that maybe the king would come through here and hand over these notebooks if he really did have them. But the other part of Gustav, the more realistic side, is maybe what he had just done is effectively signed his own death warrant, and that soon he'd become one of the many travelers who came to Abashir and never went home. A few days later, a very nervous Gustav followed a palace guard back into the throne room. And when he got in there, he immediately saw King Ali sitting on his throne. And Gustav really couldn't read his expression, so he didn't know if the king was mad at him, if he was going to be conciliatory, if he was going to help him. He had no idea. And so Gustav just walked into the room and kind of held his breath. King Ali broke the silence, and when he did, it was clear he was not angry. He was just kind of even keel. And he told Gustav that after their conversation, he had gone and spoken to the noble family that Edward had stayed with when he was here. But they told him they couldn't find any of Dr. Edward's writings. And so they had either been thrown away or lost. And so unfortunately, there was nothing to send back to Edward's elderly father. Now, Gustav did not believe this, because at this time, paper was very scarce. So there was no way they would have been throwing it away or destroying it. I mean, paper was pretty valuable. But he couldn't say that to the king, so he just swallowed his disappointment and thanked the king for asking about the notebooks, and then Gustav hoped that at this point he'd be allowed to leave. But one of the guards put their hand on Gustav's shoulder and said he needed to follow him. And at this point, Gustav's stomach dropped because he assumed he was about to go be punished for asking about Edward in the first place. And so Gustav's hands were shaking and his heart was racing as he followed the guard out of the palace and out into the courtyard, where there were some horses tied up and waiting for them. Gustav felt nauseous as he followed the guard through the city streets, and he wondered if he should just try to make a break for it and try to escape. But he looked down different streets and alleys and realized that would be totally useless because the palace guards would find him, so there was nowhere for him to go. And so Gustav had no choice but to just keep on following this guard. And so through the city they went, and then eventually they got to the city gates, and Gustav was horrified as they left the city and just began riding out into the wilderness over towards this huge mountain in the distance. And as they're making their way towards this mountain, all Gustav is thinking is, at any moment here, they're going to just dump me here to die, or they're going to ambush me, or something bad's going to happen to me. At some point, the guard led Gustav all the way to the foot of that mountain, and there, the guard abruptly stopped and climbed off his horse and just turned around and faced Gustav. And he says, "I'm going to tell you exactly what happened to Edward." And Gustav was kind of shocked by this. He really didn't know what was going to happen here. Again, he doesn't even know if he's in danger at this point. But now he's just holding his breath, waiting for potentially this mystery to finally be solved. And so the guard, he looked at Gustav and he said, "Edward committed an unforgivable crime, and he was punished for that crime." Now, at this point, Gustav was shocked because Edward was like this very well-traveled and highly respected guy, and it didn't make sense that he would commit any crime, let alone an unforgivable one that apparently cost him his life. And so Gustav kind of blurted out, like, "What crime? What did he do?" The guard explained that from day one, Edward had made lots of enemies in Abashir. He basically spent his days riding all around the city and staring at everybody and writing in his notebooks, but never talking to anybody. And so people began to gossip that maybe he was a spy. And then also the guard said Edward had climbed their sacred mountain despite being told not to, the mountain that was literally right behind them. And then also the guard said Edward was just totally unpleasant and just kind of a snobby person that nobody liked. But the guard said, none of that is actually what caused Edward to be punished. Edward's unforgivable crime, the one that caused his downfall, was his insatiable hunger for eggs. At every single meal, he refused all the food his noble host prepared for him and demanded eggs. In Abashir, eggs were quite rare and considered a precious gift, and Edward demanded them every single meal, and he ate all of that noble family's eggs. And so eventually the nobles, they could not stand Edward's disrespect, and so they went to the king. And the king, who agreed this was just awful what Edward had done, decided the only appropriate punishment was to take Edward and drag him out to the base of that sacred mountain and literally beat him to death. Dr. Edward Vogel, the proud symbol of Germany's exploring spirit, was executed because he ate an offensive number of eggs. Gustav was unharmed. He, unlike Edward, had actually bothered to learn the local customs and was highly respectful, and so he was allowed to leave the city, even after being told what happened to Edward. And he would become the first European ever to leave Abashir alive. As for Edward's notebooks and maps, they were never found. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Story editing by Evan Allen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio, Perry Kroll, and Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. At around 9 a.m. on March 6, 1963, a woman living in a nice neighborhood in Minnesota heard her doorbell ring. So she got up from her seat at the kitchen and began walking toward the door. But before she got there, the doorbell rang again. Ruth was immediately annoyed because she was thinking it had to be some salesman being really pushy, but nonetheless, she hustled to the door and she opened it up. And immediately she could tell this was no salesman. This was an emergency. Minutes later, police were swarming the neighborhood, guns drawn. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the Amazon Music follow button a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, but be sure to sneak in a single slice of cheese still wrapped in plastic. Okay, let's get into today's story. Early on the morning of March 6, 1963, 34-year-old Carol Thompson leaned toward the kitchen window of her big brick house on Hillcrest Avenue. In Minnesota, winters were long and cold, and Carol knew the snow she saw falling over the backyard wasn't heavy enough to mean that school would be canceled that day. But before Carol turned her attention back to the counter, where she was getting lunches packed for her 4 kids, she closed her eyes and thought about the trip she'd just taken a few months ago to the Minnesota Museum of American Art. The scene outside reminded her of one of the paintings she'd seen there. And a second later, all Carol wanted was to be back at that museum, not just looking at the painting, but also standing next to the man who had taken her there. Absent-mindedly, Carol began twisting the gold wedding band on her left ring finger. It wasn't her husband, Cotton Thompson, who she'd gone to the museum with. It was a man that Cotton had hired to do some work on the Thompson house more than a year ago. Carol and Cotton just called him by his nickname, Big Red. The tall, handsome, and red-haired door and window salesman had taken an immediate and obvious liking to Carol. And even after the work in the Thompson house was done, Big Red and Carol had kept in touch. Carol's husband, Cotton, who was a criminal defense attorney in downtown St. Paul, was so busy with his law practice that sometimes Carol felt forgotten, and so she had enjoyed Big Red's attention and harmless flirting. So, whenever Big Red was working in the Thompsons' upper-class neighborhood, with all the expensive Tudor-style homes with their gabled windows and exposed timber beams, Big Red would make a point to stop by the house to visit Carol. Big Red would go on strolls in the park with her, and even drove her and the 4 Thompson kids out to the family's summer home on Forest Lake, north of St. Paul. But those visits had stopped a few months ago after Cotton had become furious to find them talking and laughing together in the backyard one afternoon when he came home unexpectedly from work. Now, as Carol stood at the window, she looked down at her hands and saw what she was doing with her wedding band, and she gave herself a mental shake. It was true that Carol had been disappointed when Cotton had told Big Red to stay away from her, but as she reminded herself, Big Red had never posed any real threat to her marriage. In fact, Carol had actually been a bit thrilled to see Cotton's show of jealousy, and she had definitely enjoyed the extra attention Cotton had been paying to her ever since that backyard face-off. Besides, everything that Carol had ever really wanted in life was right here, under the roof of the 2.5-story home that Cotton had redecorated just for her, right down to the custom rugs and the color of the brand new appliances. And best of all, Carol finally had the chance to finish her college degree after 13 years at home raising their 4 kids. Turning to the kitchen counter, Carol took a deep breath, then focused her attention on the familiar tasks that made up her morning routine. With military precision, she laid out the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and fruit for the 3 Thompson girls to take to the local elementary school, and the apple that her 13-year-old son always brought to middle school. Carol had just finished packing the kids' brown bag lunches when she heard the familiar sound of Cotton's footsteps as he came down the stairs. And by the time the farm boy and Navy veteran strolled into the kitchen, Carol was already smiling. And that smile got even wider when her 36-year-old husband didn't stop until he was close enough that Carol could smell his aftershave. As she turned to face Cotton, he gave her a warm kiss on the lips. When Cotton finally stepped away, the connection between husband and wife felt like it was as strong as it had been 14 years ago when Carol had first met Cotton at Macalester College. Carol had been studying Russian literature at the small prestigious college. Cotton was 2 years ahead of her, and he was finishing his degree in economics. Cotton had an easy charm and could make people laugh, but he also had serious ambition. He wanted to be a respected and financially successful lawyer, and he had the drive to achieve those goals. They married within a year of meeting each other, and by then, Cotton had already decided that this smart, passionate woman who adored books and art was a partner he would love and cherish for the rest of his days. The two wasted no time starting a family. Carol was pregnant just a few months after the wedding. And now, looking at Cotton, Carol thought about how little he had changed. Even though Cotton's hair was still wet from a morning bath, the water hardly even darkened the color. A blonde so white that her husband had been called Cotton ever since he was a boy. Cotton knew that his wife had been annoyed when he had told Big Red that he was no longer welcome at their home. But Cotton was smart enough to know that Carol was an extremely attractive woman with her dark curly hair and easy smile, and all Big Red's interest in Carol had really done was to remind Cotton not to fall into the trap of taking his wife for granted. Cotton wanted to get home from work in time to watch the kids, so Carol could make it to school that evening. Cotton had a late meeting that day that could delay him, but he promised Carol he'd move it if he had to. He hated when she had to miss a class because of him. And also, there was another reason Cotton didn't want to stay late at work tonight. He was nervous to leave Carol home alone. Just a week earlier, everyone in St. Paul had been totally shocked by the murder of a 15-year-old high school student who had been stabbed and beaten to death. Her schoolmate had confessed to the killing just 3 days later, but the sheer brutality of the crime had put everyone in the Thompsons' neighborhood on edge. As Cotton stepped out the door with their son, he told Carol he'd give her a call sometime this morning to check in and let her know when he'd be able to get home that night. They gave each other a final kiss, and then Carol watched Cotton and Jeff disappear into the falling snow. About an hour later, as Carol was vacuuming the upstairs bedrooms, she heard the telephone ring. As she turned off the vacuum and headed downstairs to answer it, she wished that they had a second phone up in their master bedroom. Picking up the receiver in the kitchen, Carol heard Cotton's upbeat voice at the other end of the line. His secretary had apparently changed his schedule, so he would be home in time for Carol to go to her evening class. By the time Carol was off the phone and heading back upstairs to put the vacuum cleaner away, she decided that with a late night ahead of her, maybe she'd just take a break from cleaning and go back to bed. But once Carol was inside the master bedroom, she heard a sound that she didn't recognize coming from somewhere in the house. She held her breath for a second and just listened intently. Carol suddenly missed their little dog, Shotzi, who was a terribly behaved dachshund, whose bad habits included barking at everything that moved. They had just recently gotten rid of him because he chewed up all their carefully redecorated furniture. As Carol strained her ears to hear the sound again, she couldn't hear anything. The house was totally quiet. But Carol was still very much on edge. So when she heard the sound again a minute later, she leapt out of her bed, walked up to the door, and opened it to see what was going on. And when she did, she saw there was someone standing right there. Carol had no time to think. Adrenaline flooding her body, she started to fight for her life. "10 minutes later, just after 9 a.m., 3 houses east of the Thompson house, the bell rang. Ruth Nelson left her breakfast nook to answer the door. But before she got there, the bell rang again. So Ruth hustled the last few steps and opened the door, expecting to chew out a salesman for being so pushy. But instead, she saw a woman standing there, barefoot and dressed only in a blood-soaked blue bathrobe. Blood was streaming from cuts on her scalp and face. It took Ruth a moment to recognize that this was her neighbor and friend, Carol Thompson. Carol, as she looked at Ruth, she grabbed at her throat, and Ruth noticed there was something metal protruding from it. And then, in a hoarse voice, barely above a whisper, Carol begged Ruth for help. Ruth and her husband quickly helped Carol into their home, and Ruth asked Carol over and over again, "Who did this to you?" And Carol just looked at her friend and forced out a few words. She said, quote, "A man came to my house." And then Carol collapsed on the rug. A police officer and a sergeant were just a few blocks away, sitting in their squad car when they heard the dispatch call at 9:07 a.m. that morning. They arrived at the Nelson home first, where they found the victim, Carol, lying on the floor. Her eyes were open, but she couldn't speak. The doctor who lived across the street had rushed over to help when his wife saw Carol staggering down the street, and the doctor was putting pressure on Carol's most serious wounds. The police officers immediately called for help, and they would discover that the ambulance was actually already on its way. And so just a couple of minutes later, the paramedics arrived, they loaded Carol into the ambulance, and they sped off with her. Meanwhile, Ruth's adult son, who was close to Cotton's age and had known him for years, volunteered to make the difficult call to Cotton's law office. He walked slowly to the phone, took a deep breath, and then dialed. When he got Cotton on the line, he would tell him that his wife had been in some sort of accident and was now being taken to nearby Anchor Hospital. As the sirens of a half a dozen arriving police cars wailed, the two police officers who had responded first to the scene went 3 doors down to the Thompsons' house. The first thing they noticed were fresh footprints in the snow covering the brick walkway that ran from the front door to the sidewalk. Prints that could have belonged to a family member, or perhaps the assailant. The two policemen could also see that the front storm door was closed, but the inner door was open, indicating that the killer, or someone, had left in a hurry. They walked around the footprints, careful not to disturb them, as they peered inside the home. When they saw a puddle of blood on the entryway floor, they decided to wait for those squad cars to arrive before going any further. Within minutes, Detective George Barkley pulled up at the Thompson house, along with several officers of the St. Paul Police Department, where the 50-year-old detective had served for 25 years. Barkley adjusted his fedora hat as he stepped out of the car. The officers on scene told him they found that front door wide open and the side door to the house was unlocked. Detective Barkley knew that if either door had been left unlocked, then that really meant just about anyone could have entered the house and done this. Detective Barkley drew his gun and then led the officers inside the home, being very mindful that the killer could still be in the house. But after searching every room in the house, they discovered that the house was clear. There was no one else there. Barkley headed back upstairs. The kids' bedrooms were undisturbed, but the master bedroom was totally ransacked. Barkley wondered if this was maybe a robbery gone wrong. Maybe a burglar was surprised to find Carol home, and they attacked her. That would explain the chaos inside the house. But there were some things about the crime scene that didn't fit the robbery theory. They didn't really fit any coherent theory at all. As Barkley walked through the house, he just felt more and more confused by the evidence he was seeing. For some reason, the tub in the bathroom was filled with about 6 inches of lukewarm water. There was no indication that Carol had been bathing at the time of the attack. There were also smears of blood on the sink and floor, along with a 14-inch length of thick rubber hose. Clearly, the detective thought, the robber must have brought the hose, but for what reason, he didn't know. In a pool of blood near the bathroom, investigators also found pieces of black and white plastic, the broken handle to a gun. Detective Barkley tracked signs of a struggle which began upstairs and continued downstairs. Carol's fight for her life appeared to have climaxed somewhere between the front entrance to the house and the kitchen. The kitchen was totally smeared with blood, a drawer had been yanked open, and several knives had been pulled out of a tray. The drawer and the linoleum floor were also spotted red. Barkley's men eventually found a pool of blood in the front entrance, and they also found 3 live bullets on the floor. If the robber had a gun, Barkley thought, why had they stabbed Carol so many times instead of just shooting her? And finally, there was the strange question of what, if anything, had actually been stolen. From what Barkley could tell, the house was trashed, but there were pieces of jewelry and other obviously expensive items laying around. At the front entrance, sitting in a pool of blood, they even found a small woman's ring with a cluster of stones in the shape of a heart. And so if this was a robbery, it had been a very unsuccessful one. As Detective Barkley and his team examined the inside of the house, other officers canvassed the neighborhood. For everyone else on the block, it had been a totally normal Wednesday morning, with people beginning their commutes to work and getting their kids off to school. But when police spoke to all the neighbors, nobody had seen anything out of the ordinary. Carol's next-door neighbor had called Carol at 9 a.m., just about the time that Carol was getting attacked. When Carol didn't answer the phone, the neighbor actually peered into her bedroom window to see if she was home, but the neighbor said she didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Whoever attacked Carol had clearly managed to do it without attracting any attention at all, which was hard to do in such a close-knit neighborhood. That suggested to the police that her assailant was not just a crazed person roaming the streets and breaking into homes at random. Whoever assaulted Carol was clearly smart and efficient enough to get away quickly and quietly. As long as they were free, the public could still be in danger. At 10:30 a.m., so an hour and a half after the attack on Carol, the St. Paul Police Department's crime lab team arrived and began dusting for fingerprints, hoping the assailant left his mark. Neighbors peered out of windows, watching the men in overcoats and galoshes standing in the falling snow, taking notes, and snapping photographs. Police also discovered blood droplets and smears tracing Carol's path to various neighbors' houses as she ran around trying to get help. The criminologist followed Carol's footprints out the side door and around the back of her house to the house immediately to the east, and red smears indicated that Carol had rung the bell and pounded on the door and then gone to the next house over before she stumbled to Ruth's house at the corner. Nearby, at Anchor Hospital, where Carol had been taken by the ambulance, her husband, Cotton, sat in the waiting room sobbing while a team of doctors desperately tried to save Carol's life. When Carol had been brought in, she had no pulse. She lost a lot of blood, mainly from the knife wounds in her neck and scalp, and she had lots of cuts on her arms and hands. Carol had clearly fought back hard. There was a 3-inch blade stuck in Carol's throat. The surgeons had removed it, and they performed a procedure called a tracheotomy, which is when doctors cut a hole directly into a person's throat from the outside to help them breathe. But Carol's heart was barely beating, so the doctors put manual pressure on her heart to try to jumpstart it. Doctors also drilled a hole in Carol's skull to remove any blood that might have pooled inside of her head from all the blows she had taken. But ultimately, Carol's injuries proved to be too severe, and at 12:58 p.m. on March 6, 1963, 4 hours after Carol stumbled down her block looking for help, the doctors pronounced her dead. The violent assault had now become a murder investigation for the St. Paul police, and homicides in this Midwestern city were very rare. St. Paul saw an average of just 6 a year. But one of those murders had just taken place 6 days before Carol's, the beating and stabbing of a 15-year-old schoolgirl, only 2 miles from the Thompsons' home. There were some similarities between the two deadly assaults, but Detective Barkley helped put that killer behind bars 3 days before Carol was killed. The schoolgirl killing resolved quickly, but it unsettled the residents of Carol's and Cotton's fashionable Highland Park neighborhood, where there had only been a couple of homicides since the end of World War II, 18 years before, and it put a lot of pressure on Detective Barkley to solve this case fast. At the hospital, Detective Barkley spoke to Carol's grief-stricken husband. Cotton would say that Carol had been in a good mood that morning when he left for work just after 8. He also mentioned calling Carol at 8:30 that morning to tell her he would be able to watch the kids that night so she'd be able to go to school. As a defense attorney, Cotton did understand that the husband would be the number one person of interest at the start of any murder investigation, and he was patient and polite with the barrage of questions from the police. He referred investigators to his secretary, who confirmed that Cotton was indeed at his office at the time of his wife's murder. Cotton would also suggest to Detective Barkley 2 possible theories for this crime. Cotton said that it was possible that one of his former clients might have come to rob him or hurt Carol, but he couldn't think of any actual ex-associates who were disgruntled with him. He offered the police access to his client history, but he said he really didn't think it would lead them to the killer. Then Cotton told the detective his second theory. This one, he said, made much more sense than an angry client. It involved a red-haired window and door salesman that he'd done business with a year earlier. Cotton told detectives that this salesman, named Big Red, developed a clear infatuation with his wife and found every excuse to come to their house to see Carol. Cotton told police that he really didn't like the friendship, quote, that had developed between this man and his wife. Barkley asked Cotton if Carol could have been having an affair with Big Red. Cotton shook his head and said absolutely not. He had seen what was developing between Big Red and his wife, and he had stepped in to put a stop to it before it went any further. Cotton explained that a few months earlier, he had come home unexpectedly in the middle of the afternoon, and he had found Big Red in the backyard talking to his wife, and Cotton had watched them from inside the house, and Big Red had said something that made Carol laugh. Her eyes were sparkling, and then Big Red put a hand on Carol's waist, and at that point, Cotton said he burst out the side door and told Big Red to stay away from his wife and his kids, and they proceeded to get into this big shouting match. Cotton was ready to punch Big Red, but before any fists flew, Big Red ultimately stormed off, and as he left, Big Red vowed that this would not be the last time they saw him. The police would also speak to Carol and Cotton's neighbors on either side of their house to see if they knew anything about this relationship Carol had with Big Red, and the neighbors would say they saw Big Red around, spending time with Carol and the kids, and it just seemed like he was a friend of the family. The neighbors did say, though, that it seemed like Big Red was flirting with Carol, and none could blame him for liking their attractive neighbor. Beneath her horn-rimmed glasses, Carol had this winning smile and quick wit. I mean, she was amazing. And Carol had admitted to her neighbors that she found Big Red very attractive. They both liked art and literature, neither of which held any appeal for Cotton, but Carol swore to whoever she talked to that she and Big Red were just friends. However, whatever the real status of that relationship was, Detective Barkley knew he now had his first good lead. Barkley tracked down Big Red at work that afternoon and drove him to the station. Big Red sat with his head in his hands, sobbing as he answered the detective's questions about his relationship to the Thompson family. He confirmed that he had developed a friendship with Carol after he sold Cotton some windows for their house, and he admitted that after that job was finished, he would swing by to see Carol when he was in the neighborhood. Big Red told police that he had taken Carol to an art museum a couple of times, and once he drove Carol and the kids to their summer home, but he was adamant that he had had nothing to do with Carol's death. He told Barkley that after his backyard altercation with Cotton, he dropped his friendship with Carol altogether. Big Red figured that it would be best for him to stay away. He said he hadn't seen Carol since the dust-up with Cotton, and at 9 a.m. on March 6th, when Carol was attacked, Big Red said he was at a sales conference, which his boss would back up. And so, this case was clearly not going to wrap up as fast as Detective Barkley hoped, and the police department was really starting to feel the heat. News of Carol's murder sent shockwaves through the Highland Park and larger Twin Cities communities. A home invasion in that exclusive neighborhood was unthinkable, and the victim, an all-American housewife and mother of 4, was well known in the community and universally adored. To imagine such a woman meeting such a brutal end shook people to the core, and the killer, whoever they were, was still out there. Nervous housewives peered out of their windows, refusing to answer the door for deliveries or door-to-door salesmen, and husbands began coming home early from work every night. In a town that rarely saw a locked door, chain locks were now flying off the shelves of hardware stores. Sporting goods stores ran out of shotgun shells and pistols and bullets. Public officials demanded results. In response, across the Twin Cities region, police rounded up anyone who could in any way be considered a suspect. Wives turned in abusive husbands, petty thieves and sex offenders were pulled off the street, police hauled in peeping toms, public drunks, and known burglars. They threw homeless men, even the disabled and mentally ill, into squad cars and took them downtown. Anyone that seemed even a little bit different or, quote, suspicious in any way, the police fingerprinted and interrogated. But none seemed connected to the case. As the month of March 1963 ticked away, Detective Barkley was starting to get frustrated. He had no fingerprints and no eyewitnesses. His victim had problems in her marriage, but both her husband and the other man she had gotten close to had very solid alibis. The crime scene looked like a robbery, except nothing had been stolen. The only good evidence he really had was the black and white pieces of plastic laminate that police had found in the entryway of the home and in the upstairs hallway. They were very likely parts of the handle of some kind of gun. Detective Barkley figured if he could just identify the weapon, maybe it could lead him to his killer. So he sent the pieces of plastic off to the FBI for analysis, and then he waited very impatiently for a few weeks, and then finally he got his answer. The plastic pieces were indeed from the grip of a gun. They were from a custom-made pistol grip for a 7.65mm Luger pistol. Detective Barkley felt relief at finally making progress here, and now he was hopeful that this would lead to the break in the case that he so badly needed. And so, on April 5th, 1 month after the murder, Detective Barkley and the St. Paul police chief held a televised press conference. They affixed those customized pieces of the pistol grip onto an identical Luger and displayed images of it in poster-sized photos. Barkley and the police chief blasted these pictures all over the state in hopes that someone would recognize this custom gun and call the police to tell them who it belonged to. In the days following the press conference, Barkley began combing through the numerous tips he had from the public since the murder. And at some point, he found an unnamed source claiming that Cotton had taken out $900,000 in life insurance on his wife across 3 carriers. And some of those policies were apparently written as recently as 2 months before the murder. Barkley looked into this claim, and he soon discovered that Cotton had indeed taken out policies, but with 8 carriers totaling $1.1 million, about $10 million in today's dollars. At this time, the average American was making less than $10,000 a year. Investigators spoke to Carol's parents. Her father, who was a successful heating and plumbing contractor in St. Paul, valued his own estate at about $600,000, which would be about $6 million today. Carol, being an only child, was set to inherit all of that money. Meaning, if she were to die, the family fortune was set to go to her and Cotton and the kids. Detective Barkley started wondering if this, quote, pillar of the community, aka Cotton, was not really the man he presented himself to be. As his investigators spoke to more people in the Thompson circle of friends, he learned that Cotton was often seen around town with other women. Cotton started to look really suspicious to Barkley. But being a bad husband and buying life insurance was not illegal, and Barkley could find no connection between Cotton and the murder weapon. But before Barkley got too deep into his re-examination of Cotton, his press conference about the Luger totally paid off. On April 9th, he received a call from someone claiming that the Luger was actually his. A traveling salesman from Minneapolis told police that his apartment had been burglarized on February 14th, 3 weeks before Carol's murder, and one of the items he reported stolen was that pistol. He had made the customized hand grip in a shop class at a local community college. Detective Barkley confirmed that the salesman was nowhere near St. Paul the day of Carol's murder, and so could not have been her killer. Finally, this felt to Barkley like a really solid lead backed by evidence. But it presented a whole new set of challenges. Now Barkley had to solve a burglary in another city in the hopes that the perpetrator of that crime was also the one who committed this murder. But it wouldn't take long for the police to catch another break. On April 17th, so 8 days after that salesman called to say that Luger was his, 2 masked men burst into a bar in St. Paul, they drew their guns, and demanded the bartender hand over the cash in his till. Then one of the robbers punched the bartender before taking the money and escaping with his accomplice. A few days later, St. Paul police arrested the 2 men on suspicion of burglary and assault. The tavern robbery was the latest of several robberies they had committed in the area. When police got the thieves into interview rooms in the jail, one of the robbers struck a deal with the county and started talking. He had information the police wanted. He knew all about that special Luger the cops were looking for. He and his buddy were the ones who actually stole it. The robber claimed that he had only had the Luger for a month. He told police that 2 weeks before Carol's murder, he had given the gun to a man that he and his accomplice knew. His name was Norman Mastrian. The cops knew Norman too. He was a former champion boxer whose life had gone totally south, and he'd had lots of scrapes with the law. In fact, he was actually a suspect in another murder, but detectives couldn't find enough evidence to charge him. Detective Barkley thought Norman was certainly capable of killing Carol, but the robber told police that Norman was not the last person he had seen with that Luger. The day before Carol got murdered, the robber watched Norman give it to someone else, a guy named Dick W.C. Anderson. and police did some digging, and they discovered that Dick was a Korean War veteran with a Purple Heart. And to get a Purple Heart, it means you got injured in combat. But Dick also had a drinking problem, and he had been through a bitter divorce, and he was now apparently a petty criminal, but it really didn't seem like he was a murderer. And Dick had absolutely no connections to the Thompsons, so why would he kill Carol? It felt like the more clues Detective Barkley and his team found, the more of a mystery this case became. Detective Barkley had no problem finding Norman Mastrian, the former champion boxer, but Dick Anderson, the last one to have the Luger, was another story. Dick had left town in a hurry after seeing Barkley's press conference about the Luger. Detective Barkley put out an all-points bulletin across the country with a description of Dick. It was a long shot, but on May 19th, it paid off. 1,700 miles from St. Paul, police in Phoenix, Arizona, entered a cheap motel on an unrelated matter, and they recognized the man who was checking out at the time as Dick Anderson. Police immediately extradited Dick back to Minnesota, and after 3 days in jail, Dick Anderson would confess to everything. And suddenly, all the loose ends and confusing, conflicting pieces of evidence made a terrible kind of sense. The story that Dick had to tell was far more shocking than anything Detective Barkley or any of his colleagues had imagined. Here's what really happened on March 6, 1963, the day Carol Thompson was murdered. Before dawn, Dick Anderson slipped into the Thompson house through the unlocked side door while everyone in the house was asleep. Dick moved silently through the kitchen and headed down to the basement where he waited in the dark. Now, what Dick was doing was not his typical line of work. However, he was broke, and the $3,000 that Norman Mastrian had offered him to do what he was going to do was a lot of money, and so he had agreed to do it. So Dick waited in the darkness of a stranger's basement, periodically glancing at the hand-drawn map he had been given of the home's layout. Dick had also fortified his courage with vodka and amphetamines, and so his heart was racing. The sun rose and Dick listened as just a few feet above his head in the kitchen, Carol got her family fed and out the door. About 20 minutes later, Carol answered the telephone. It was Cotton calling from the office, telling her he'd be home in time for Carol to go to class that evening. Meanwhile, in the basement, Dick grasped the 14-inch length of thick rubber tubing Norman had given him. Dick's plan was to slip into the kitchen and strike Carol on the back of the head with this rubber. He thought a clean blow would totally knock her out. Dick could hear Carol's voice, muffled through the floorboards, as she spoke to her husband. Dick carefully headed up the stairs until one of the wooden steps let out a loud squeak. He heard Carol's voice stop cold. Dick froze and waited to hear Carol resume her phone call. He realized that Carol would hear him coming if he continued up the stairs, so he revised his plan. He would wait in the basement until he was sure Carol had left the kitchen. Eventually, Dick would hear Carol vacuuming on the second floor for several minutes, and then right as he was about to go up, he heard the phone ring again. But this time, Carol did not come downstairs to answer it. She stayed upstairs and let it ring. And so at this point, Dick made his move. He ascended the last few basement steps, he padded through the empty kitchen and climbed the main stairs to the second floor. And as he did this, Carol heard him, and she walked to her bedroom door right as he arrived in front of her bedroom door. And when Carol opened it up, she was totally startled to see this man she had never seen before standing in her house. But before she could scream, Dick told Carol that he was just here to rob her. He promised that if she did what she was told, she would get through this just fine. And so Carol did as she was told, and she laid down face first on the floor, at which point Dick struck her in the back of the head with that thick rubber hose, knocking her out. He then dragged Carol's unconscious body down the second floor landing, leaving her in front of the bathroom door for a moment. Then Dick looked into the bathroom, and he saw water in the bathtub, just as Norman had told him to expect. But as Dick began dragging Carol into the bathroom, Carol woke up, and immediately she began fighting back. Dick, in a panic, pulled out the Luger to shoot her, but the pistol wouldn't fire, and so he just began bashing the pistol into Carol's face. Blood flowed from Carol's forehead, but she just kept on fighting. Dick hit her again and again, hard enough to break off a piece of the gun's white and black plastic laminate grip. Carol eventually managed to separate herself from her attacker, and she scrambled down the stairs, tumbling into the entryway, and she tried to escape out the front door. But Dick caught up to her right as she was struggling to open up the chain latch, and he continued to bludgeon her over and over again with his now broken gun. Another piece of the handle would break off during this beating downstairs, and 3 live rounds would pop out of the gun. At this point, Dick was totally panicking, and he left Carol on the floor moaning in pain, and he ran into the kitchen. There, he rifled through a door and grabbed a 3-inch paring knife to finish Carol off. Dick descended on Carol in the hallway between the kitchen and front entrance and began stabbing her over and over. On the 50th blow, the knife got stuck in Carol's throat, and when Dick tried to pull it out again, the blade snapped off the handle. At this point, Carol finally stopped moving, and Dick climbed off her, marveling at her will to live. But now it was over, and Dick had things to do before getting out of there as fast as he could. Upstairs in the bathroom, Dick turned on the sink and washed the blood off his shaking hands. He then rushed into the neatly kept master bedroom, pulling out drawers, knocking things over to make it look like this was a robbery gone bad. As Dick bounded down the stairs, he didn't notice that Carol was no longer where he had left her, in the short hallway that led to the kitchen. Dick had no clue that as he was heading out the front door, Carol was stumbling down the block looking for help. Dick left the Highland Park neighborhood and connected with Norman. Nothing in their plan had gone as expected. What was supposed to be a bloodless killing had turned into a gory and violent mess. Together, they disposed of the gun in a swampland north of St. Paul, and then when Norman returned to his home, he picked up the phone to make the hardest call of all. At the other end of the line was the man who had plotted Carol's death from the start and actually put up the money to make it happen. This was the one person Carol had loved and trusted since she first met him 14 years ago at Macalester College. It was Carol's husband, Eugene Cotton Thompson, and he had been planning his wife's murder for almost 2 years. Cotton had been in an on-again, off-again affair for 3 years with a woman named Jackie Olson. He met Jackie when he represented her in a divorce. Cotton handled divorces as well as criminal cases. The attractive young mother didn't have the money to pay him, so Cotton got her a job as a stenographer so she could work it off. She'd go to, quote, business dinners with Cotton and out-of-town trips, while Carol stayed home with the kids. Cotton enjoyed his illicit romance, but Jackie wanted to build a life with him. When Cotton balked at leaving Carol and his kids, Jackie said fine, and she married another man. But when Jackie's new relationship hit the rocks fast, Cotton made another play for her. He promised Jackie that they wouldn't have to worry about Carol anymore, and they'd have plenty of money to live on for the rest of their lives. One of the clients that Cotton represented as a defense attorney was an old classmate from Macalester who had had several scrapes with the law, including being roped into an unrelated murder. This person was Norman Mastrian, and Norman didn't have to plan anything. Cotton had that all figured out. A month before the murder, Cotton got rid of the family dog who barked whenever anything came into the house. Cotton had removed the upstairs phone 2 days before the murder, telling Carol he would swap it out for a phone that fit the house's new color scheme. He planned to call Carol on the morning of the murder, which would ensure that she would go into the kitchen, where the only phone left in the house was located. It was here that Cotton planned for Norman to strike her with the rubber hose and knock her out, and then Norman was supposed to carry an unconscious Carol up the stairs to the bathroom where there would be water left in the tub. Cotton did not typically bathe before work, but on the day of the murder, he would. And he'd leave the stopper in the drain so Norman could fill Carol's lungs with the water. Cotton figured they could make it look like Carol slipped in the tub, hit her head, and then drowned in the bathwater. Knowing that the police would be looking at Cotton as their first suspect, he had had an airtight alibi. He'd be at work making phone calls with his secretary. Cotton planned to finger Big Red for the murder. But Cotton's plan unraveled in a few key places. First, Norman Mastrian, despite whatever crimes he had committed up to that point, he couldn't bring himself to actually kill a church-going mother of 4. So he had subcontracted out the actual killing and did not tell Cotton. Norman gave Dick Anderson the same marching orders Cotton had given him. But Dick wanted more than just a piece of rubber tubing with him when he entered the Thompson house, and so he asked Norman for a backup weapon in the form of a gun. Norman then turned to his 2 robber friends who gave him the customized Luger pistol they'd recently stolen when they burglarized an apartment, and Norman gave it to Dick. Cotton could never have anticipated that pieces of a gun he never planned on using during this attack would then lead police to the hitman, who would then confess everything he knew. Police arrested Cotton on June 20th, 1963, 2 months after Carol's murder. In November of 1963, just 8 months after the murder, a jury found Cotton Thompson guilty, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison. As for Norman Mastrian, the middleman for the hit, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison, all of which he served, and as for Dick Anderson, the man who actually killed Carol, he would spend almost 2 decades behind bars. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, many of which are not available on this podcast. Again, that YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. One evening in March of 1974, an investigator in Salt Lake City, Utah, sat across an interrogation table from a man who claimed he had psychic powers. Now, the investigator had naturally been quite skeptical of this man and his powers, but the man began giving him a bunch of very specific visions about the case the investigator was trying to solve. And in fact, some of the information he was revealing was enough to make the investigator wonder, could this man actually be a psychic? Or was he the killer? But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please go on an unbelievable, amazing vacation with the follow button and volunteer to take pictures for them. But every time you take a picture of them, secretly turn the camera around and just take selfies of yourself. Okay, let's get into today's story. On March 11, 1974, 22-year-old Barbara Rocky sat at a desk in her bedroom in Provo, Utah, writing furiously. And as she was writing, eventually she paused for a minute to reread what she had written, but she wasn't quite happy yet, so she added a few more lines. The letter she was writing was for her roommates, and she knew it had to be perfect, because Barbara was saying goodbye. So Barbara was a junior at Brigham Young University, or BYU, which was a very religious school where most students were practicing Mormons, but not Barbara. She had chosen to go to BYU because of religion, but really just because she was fascinated by it and thought going to a school structured around faith would be very interesting. But when she actually got there, she immediately felt out of place because her classmates went to church every week for hours at a time, and they all followed a pretty strict set of behavioral rules and values, which wasn't really Barbara's thing. Barbara was from California and considered herself more of a free spirit who liked exploring new ideas and trying new things. So over the last 3 years, Barbara had felt both frustrated and also alienated by the other students' very rigid lifestyles. She'd been hoping that that would change with her new living situation. She'd just moved in with 7 other girls in January. But now, just 2 months into that, it was already very obvious that those girls did not like her. They were just as religious as the rest of the kids at BYU, and they seemed to think Barbara was weird for doing things like dating around and experimenting with different religions. It just didn't make sense to them. So Barbara had decided that instead of trying to change her roommates' minds, she would just lean into this kind of weird behavior, as they called it. Barbara basically started making them uncomfortable on purpose, like by saying she prayed to the devil, which totally shocked them. And after a while, Barbara had really got the sense that these girls, they weren't just weirded out by her, they were now actively scared of her, which really alienated Barbara a whole lot more. And so all of that was why Barbara was now writing this letter. She was telling her roommates that she was just going to go ahead and leave campus for a while to be with people that actually understood her. And the people she was thinking of were people like Richard Finder, a self-proclaimed psychic that Barbara had connected with after she'd called into a radio show where Richard had been giving psychic readings. And the two of them had connected immediately, because even though Richard was almost a decade older than her, he understood Barbara in a way that no one else in her life did. And ever since, they'd had this really intense relationship that felt both romantic and spiritual at the same time. But since Richard lived far away, most of their relationship so far had been over the phone. And so Barbara thought it might be nice to be physically closer to Richard and also his circle of friends. But there was another reason Barbara wanted to get away from BYU. And that was because she had started to feel unsafe being a young woman on a college campus. So recently there had been some scary national news stories about college women being attacked on campus. One student in Washington State had been beaten and almost killed in her dorm room in January, and another woman had gone missing the following month. And even though these attacks had not literally happened at BYU, it still freaked Barbara out. I mean, especially because these women who had been targeted just looked a lot like her physically, with long dark hair and sort of similar features. And so as a precaution, Barbara had been taking judo classes at school, and even got her best friend, Jerry Hicker, to help her buy a gun. Except Barbara had actually lost her gun recently. She'd not been able to find it for the last few weeks. She'd reported it missing to the campus police, but she really had no idea where it went. But for now, Barbara forgot about the gun and just took a deep breath and finished up her goodbye letter. Then she glanced over at the clock and saw it was almost 10 a.m., and so she had to get to class. So she grabbed the letter and put it inside of her purse, where she also was holding a turquoise necklace, which she planned to sell that day. It was the single most valuable thing that she owned, and she was going to pawn it to get some seed money to leave town. She'd figure out her actual destination based on how much she got for it. As Barbara threw her bag over her shoulder and got ready to leave, she heard a car pull into the driveway outside, which was a relief because she'd actually let her best friend Jerry borrow her car to go skiing the other day, and she had been hoping he would drop it off before she left for class, and so clearly that's what he was doing. And so Barbara hurried out her front door, and sure enough, there was her car, and there was Jerry climbing out and waving her keys, basically being like, "Hey, I'm back." As Jerry handed the car keys back over to Barbara, he asked her if they were still on for hanging out later. But Barbara was busy thinking about getting to class and the logistics of selling her necklace. She had decided that Salt Lake City would have more pawn shops that would pay better, and it was also less than an hour north. And so now that Jerry had dropped her car off, she could drive up there right after class. And so, Barbara just kind of nodded at Jerry and whatever he was saying, and then she took the keys, jumped in her car, and she was off. Over an hour later, Barbara was sitting in her social work class, waiting for the teacher to dismiss them. And as she was sitting there, she began to hear some students whispering behind her. And as they did, even though she couldn't quite hear what they were saying, she began to feel her face get red. Because even though she didn't know if they were talking about her, if they were, it certainly would not be the first time. People talked about her a lot. So Barbara just did her best to try to ignore them. And then as soon as the teacher said they could go, she jumped up and shoved her books into her bag. And then she hurried out of the building to where her car was parked. She got in and pulled out of the lot. And as she made her way down the street, she actually felt a wave of excitement. She couldn't wait to sell this necklace and finally get out of this place. About 3 hours later, Barbara's best friend Jerry walked up the sidewalk to Barbara's house. He thought they had plans to meet up that afternoon, but Barbara never showed. And Barbara did not usually just blow off plans without calling, so now he was actually at her house just to make sure she was okay. And now Jerry noticed that her car was not in her driveway. So he just stood there for a minute, wondering if maybe he should go in and ask her roommates where she was. But he ultimately decided against it and just instead headed back to his place. But after beginning the walk back to his place, he passed by an apartment complex down the street from Barbara's place, and he stopped because he could clearly see Barbara's car parked in the lot, which was definitely out of the ordinary because Jerry was sure she did not know anybody who lived there. And so now, really starting to worry about Barbara, Jerry walked up to her car to check it out, And when he looked inside, he saw there was a note. And so he just opened up her car because he found it was unlocked, and he grabbed the note and he began to read it. And as he did, he felt his heart rate start to pick up. An hour later, Jerry ran into the campus police station with Barbara's roommates following right behind him. After finding the note inside of Barbara's car, Jerry had gone back to Barbara's house to show it to her roommates and ask if they had seen her, because now he was worried that this note was some kind of suicide note. The note was a goodbye letter that Barbara apparently had written, and it said that she was leaving to be with her people, and the tone of it was just kind of alarming. Now, Jerry could tell her roommates thought that he was overreacting to this note, but they had ultimately agreed to come with him to the police to just make sure everything was okay. And so as soon as the officer on duty came out, Jerry explained to him that he had had plans with Barbara that day and she had not shown up, which was very uncharacteristic. And then he explained how he found her car and then also this letter and his concerns about this letter. And the officer on duty said, okay, we'll look into it. And so over the next few hours, the campus police did look into it. They reached out to some other kids on campus and also to Barbara's family, but nobody had seen or heard from Barbara since that morning. And so the police continued to look into this, realizing this could be a missing persons case, but technically not enough time had passed to officially call it that. So in this first day, it was all just kind of preliminary. The next day, almost 50 miles north of the BYU campus, a worker for a Utah utility company hiked up a trail in Big Cottonwood Canyon, a hilly nature preserve on the outskirts of Salt Lake City. Officially, he was there to check on some water lines. But he was also, taking his time and enjoying himself. This area was beautiful. It was high up in the mountains and very remote and peaceful. So this guy was genuinely shocked when he reached the top of the trail and saw he was not alone. There was a woman up there. But at first, the way his brain processed what he was seeing is he saw this woman who was lying on the ground and she appeared to be nude or partially nude. And he thought, oh, she's sunbathing. Like that's what she's doing up here. But then he's like, it's March. It's cold. And she's face down, and she's definitely totally naked. And then he took a few more steps forward, and his brain kind of processed what he was seeing, at which point he just gasped, turned around, and ran back to his car to go alert the police. Within the hour, Captain Pete Hayward with the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office drove his cruiser along a remote access road that led to Big Cottonwood Canyon. So Hayward normally loved being in nature. All he really did in his spare time was hunt and fish. But right now, the scenery and remote location were actually kind of an inconvenience because he needed to get to his destination quickly, and that was just very hard to do out here. Hayward had just gotten a call about a woman who had been found dead in the canyon by a worker for a utility company. And while a few responders were actually already there securing the scene, Hayward knew they wouldn't be able to really do anything until he got there. Because when he worked a murder case, every single detail had to go through him. A few minutes later, Hayward saw some police cars up ahead on the side of the road, and also a deputy waiting by a trailhead. And so he pulled over, got out, and then followed the deputy up a steep trail for about 300 yards. And he was pretty out of breath by the time he saw a few other crime scene techs and officers gathered around a bush, where underneath the bush there was a body of a naked woman lying face down on the ground. Hayward walked over and crouched down to examine the body, and right away he could see at least 3 bullet wounds in the woman's back. But other than that, he didn't see any other injuries, and there were no clear signs of decomposition. His best guess was that this woman had been there for maybe a day or so, which was actually sort of a miracle when he thought about it. This time of year, nobody came out to this area. And if it hadn't been for that utility worker, she might not have been found for months. Hayward looked next to the body, and he saw the woman's clothes and shoes were right nearby. And each item was actually folded very neatly, which struck him as a little bit strange. Hayward pulled on a glove and began examining the clothing, and he could see that there was really nothing ripped or damaged. And also, as Hayward kind of walked around the immediate area, he noticed the whole scene was just as neat as the clothes. There was no gun anywhere, and no marks in the dirt or signs of a struggle or a fight, and there was no indication that the body had been dragged around, and so Hayward felt pretty confident that this woman was likely shot and killed in the exact spot she was found in. Hayward stood in the middle of the trail and considered everything he was seeing. The neatly folded clothes could have been removed during consensual sex, and then maybe things turned violent, or they could mean the woman was maybe forced to undress at gunpoint. Either way, Hayward's gut told him that this woman's killer was someone she knew, because the thing was, getting up here from the road was not easy. I mean, Hayward was pushing 50 and knew he was not in the best shape, but even for somebody who was young and fit, it would be hard to force another person all the way up a trail like this. It made more sense that this woman had first walked up willingly with someone she likely trusted, and then that person killed her once they were up there. But Hayward knew, his theory didn't mean much until he figured out who this woman was. She didn't seem to have a purse with her, and there was no ID in the pockets of her folded clothes. So Hayward waved some other officers over to help him flip her body over so they could look underneath her. And when they did that, Hayward saw there were a few bullets gathered in the dirt. They'd clearly gone straight through this woman from the shots in her back. And so Hayward quickly told a tech to go ahead and photograph and bag the bullets for testing, and also to get some of the dirt that the bullets had been lodged in case there was some other evidence mixed in. So investigators in the 1970s did not rely on DNA yet, but they could test for things like clothing fibers or hairs and potentially connect that material to suspects. And so after giving his team their marching orders, Hayward took a deep breath and then headed back down the trail. He needed to go find this woman's name. The next day, Wednesday, March 13th, Hayward hustled down a hallway towards a meeting room at the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office. He was bleary-eyed and basically running on adrenaline because he'd been working this case non-stop since the day before. And he'd just come from a meeting with the ballistics expert who told him the gun that killed this woman was likely a .357 caliber. Now, this was obviously great for the investigation. However, a .357 was not particularly uncommon, so it didn't really narrow things down a whole bunch. However, Hayward had uncovered something that was major for the investigation, and that was the victim's identity. It was 22-year-old Barbara Rockey. So Hayward's team had put a broadcast out over the news the night before about the discovery of this body. And after they had put that out, they had gotten a call from the BYU police about a student of theirs who had gone missing a day earlier. And just a few hours ago, some of this missing student's classmates had come up to Salt Lake City to identify the body, and they had confirmed it was Barbara. Now, Hayward had spoken to some of those kids already, and he had some other officers contacting Barbara's family. But right now, Hayward was on his way to get a formal statement from a young man named Jerry Hicker. Jerry was one of the people who identified the body, and he was the first person to report Barbara missing. So Hayward was hoping he would have information that could point them towards Barbara's killer. Minutes later, Hayward sat down at a conference table across from Jerry, and from the looks of it, Jerry was very rattled. He kept shaking his head and looking away like he was trying not to cry, but Hayward was not a particularly gentle interviewer, so he didn't waste time with condolences or tissues, especially because Jerry was an obvious suspect. He was Barbara's closest friend at school, apparently, and Hayward was sure Barbara was killed by somebody she trusted. So he just bluntly told Jerry that he needed to know every single thing that happened on the day Barbara went missing. Jerry was sort of caught off guard by this level of bluntness, but he took a shaky breath and then explained how he'd borrowed Barbara's car the day before and then dropped it back off at her place on Monday morning around 10 a.m. And then he went to the library for a few hours. He then said he was supposed to meet up with Barbara. They had plans for later that day to hang out, but Barbara didn't show up. And when he went to her house to check on her car was gone. And so he began walking back home again when he actually saw her car down the block outside of an apartment complex that he didn't understand she would be at. Like, he didn't think she knew anybody who lived over there. And he said he walked up to the car, looked inside, and saw there was a note. He tried the door handle, it was open, he reached inside, got the note out, and he read it, and he said it was a pretty disturbing note. He thought it was maybe a suicide note. Hayward nodded. He had seen the note. The BYU police had given it to him. It did seem to be from Barbara, telling her roommates she was leaving town to be with people who she fit in with, but the note was kind of vague, and Hayward really wasn't sure what to make of it just yet. It could be a suicide note, or it could be something entirely ordinary. And the truth was, he wasn't actually even sure that Barbara had really written the letter. Maybe her killer had written the letter. Maybe whoever murdered Barbara was attempting to make her disappearance look like a suicide, or maybe imply that she had run away in the hopes that police would never find her body. And so Hayward had sent the letter off to a handwriting expert to see what they thought. Now, Hayward asked Jerry about his relationship with Barbara. And Jerry explained that the two of them hung out a ton and she had gravitated towards him since she felt sort of unwelcome at school and around her roommates, who didn't really like her because she wasn't religious like they were. Jerry also told Hayward that Barbara had made the conflict with her roommates much worse by intentionally saying sacrilegious things in order to freak them out. So he said there was a lot of tension between them, and it had gotten so bad that at one point he had tried to find Barbara another place to live. This made Hayward perk up. I mean, knowing that Barbara had a potential domestic conflict was an interesting lead. Even though a group of young, devout Mormon women were not necessarily obvious murder suspects, it was definitely worth looking into. Maybe one of them had been so horrified and outraged by Barbara's teasing that they'd snapped and tried to hurt her. Hayward didn't have any other questions for Jerry, so he stood up and told him he could go. He wasn't ready to eliminate anybody as a suspect just yet, but so far, Jerry seemed pretty unlikely. He had an alibi, and he was also the one who reported Barbara missing. And considering it was complete luck that her body was even found at all in the area that it was, it really would have been in the killer's best interest to keep quiet and hope her body was never found. So why would Jerry go to police at all if he was the killer? So Hayward headed out the door to wrangle some officers. They needed to go to Provo and have another word with Barbara's roommates. The next afternoon, just 2 days after Barbara was found in the canyon, Hayward pulled up to a pawn shop on the outskirts of Salt Lake City. If he thought he was tired yesterday, well, he was absolutely exhausted now, because a lot had happened in the last 24 hours. They'd gotten in touch with Barbara's family, who were obviously shocked and devastated, but they didn't have any useful information for the investigation. They didn't know much about Barbara's friends or life at school, so they couldn't say if anybody would have wanted to hurt her. And they'd had no idea if she had been planning to leave campus for any reason. But apparently, she was, because the handwriting expert had come back and confirmed the note was authentic, and Barbara did write it. So her plans to leave appeared to be genuine, which is what the note basically was about, if you read it literally. But for Hayward, after speaking to Jerry, who talked about the tension between Barbara and her roommates and how she didn't fit in, and also after Hayward literally spoke to all 7 of Barbara's roommates, and they all actually admitted they did not like Barbara, it made Hayward think that the letter from Barbara should be interpreted literally, that she was just trying to flee campus and get away, in particular from her roommates. But the roommates all had solid alibis for the day Barbara went missing. So for now, Hayward basically had to rule out the roommates. But Hayward was not that upset about this, because the roommates had actually given him another lead. According to one of the roommates, right before Barbara had disappeared, she had mentioned that she planned to pawn a turquoise necklace that she owned in Salt Lake City. So Hayward and some other officers had spent the whole day canvassing pawn shops in that area to see if maybe she had actually gone through with it. Now, so far, Hayward had not found the necklace or, found the pawn shop that maybe Barbara went to, but he was very hopeful, maybe too hopeful in some ways. Because, aside from this necklace lead, the investigation really was kind of losing steam. They had searched and fingerprinted Barbara's car, but had not found anything significant. They'd also gotten the autopsy back, and it was mostly unhelpful. The medical examiner had actually counted 5 gunshot wounds, not just 3, so more than Hayward had thought, but they couldn't confirm whether or not Barbara was sexually assaulted. And also, the forensics report had come back, and they had not been able to collect any fingerprints at the scene. And so all of this was swirling around in Hayward's head as he stepped into this particular pawn shop, and he asked the woman behind the counter if they had recently purchased a turquoise necklace. And to his shock, the woman said yes. And then she gestured towards a glass case behind the counter where Hayward could see a long white necklace lined with turquoise stones on a red felt pad. About a half an hour later, Hayward was back behind the wheel of his cruiser, and his heart was pounding and his mind was racing so fast he could barely pay attention to the road, because Hayward finally had a real trail here. The shop clerk's description of the person who had sold that turquoise necklace matched Barbara perfectly. Not only that, the shopkeeper also had a receipt for the sale that showed Barbara was at the store on March 11th at 12:50 p.m., the same day she went missing. But the most incredible part of this new lead was that Barbara had apparently told this clerk that she was in a hurry because her boyfriend was circling the block outside. And this was huge because Hayward and his team had spoken to a lot of people in Barbara's life, and no one had mentioned a boyfriend. Now, unfortunately, the pawn shop worker had not gotten a look at this person, this boyfriend that Barbara was talking about. So Hayward had just taken the necklace and the receipt for evidence, and now he was rushing back to the precinct to make some calls. He needed to see if anybody in Barbara's life knew about this boyfriend and maybe had just failed to mention it for some reason. But as soon as Hayward parked and hurried inside the precinct, he was stopped by a deputy, and this deputy seemed as excited and frazzled as Hayward felt. The deputy told Hayward that he wasn't going to believe this, but they had been continuing their background interviews, and some of Barbara's friends said that Barbara had mentioned a boyfriend named Richard. This was great news for Hayward. I mean, he was literally looking for exactly this information. But this actually was not the reason why the deputy was so worked up, just the fact that she had a boyfriend. He explained that Richard was Richard Finder, a supposed psychic from California who just happened to be in town on a ski vacation at the same time Barbara was killed. And the reason they knew that was because Richard had just called the station completely out of the blue and offered to help. A few hours later, Hayward sat down across an interrogation table from 30-year-old Richard Finder. Richard had on glasses and he had a goatee, and he seemed very confident and also quite eager to help. But to Hayward, he just felt like he was putting on an act. He felt certain that Richard had to be Barbara's killer. After all, it actually was not unusual for murderers to actually insert themselves into the murder investigation to sort of, see what's going on and maybe deflect blame away from themselves. And so for Hayward, he felt like that was exactly what Richard was doing, calling in to offer up his supposed psychic services. But also, Hayward had spent the last couple of hours digging into Richard, and he also discovered that he owned a .357 pistol, the same kind of gun that had killed Barbara. And on top of that, he found out the place where Richard was staying was in Salt Lake City, very close to Big Cottonwood Canyon, where Barbara's body was found. It was just too many coincidences. And so Hayward was prepared to get extremely tough with Richard to get a confession. But Hayward got a few of his background questions out of the way first. And after asking Richard how he knew Barbara, Richard explained that they had connected after she had heard him speak on the radio. And he said that they'd actually never been physical, but they'd had a deep spiritual relationship. After that, Hayward cut to the chase and just asked Richard point blank why he had called the station. And at that point, Richard became very serious and said that he needed to come forward because he had a feeling about what had happened to Barbara. He said, he was a psychic and he had a vision that the gun, the murder weapon, had been thrown in some water somewhere. Hayward couldn't believe what he was hearing because, the police had not announced the murder weapon was missing. Richard shouldn't have known they were looking for the murder weapon, but clearly he did. So at this point, Hayward did not ask more questions about what his vision said. Instead, he demanded that Richard account for every single hour of his day on Monday, March 11th, the day that Barbara went missing. And for the first time, Richard actually seemed genuinely thrown off. He just sort of stared back at Hayward in what seemed to be complete shock. And then he said he didn't kill Barbara. He said he couldn't have. He was with his friends the whole day. Hayward just kind of glared at Richard and then slid a pad of paper over to him to write down his friend's information so they could follow up. And as he watched Richard hurry to jot down some names and numbers, Hayward felt sure this was their guy. There was just a mountain of circumstantial evidence here against him. But he knew they needed something more concrete to actually make an arrest. So Hayward first would have to check out Richard's alibi, and then also test Richard's personal gun, his .357, against the bullets that had killed Barbara. So he told Richard that for now he could go, but they would need to take a look at his gun. A few weeks later, Hayward sat at his desk in the sheriff's office staring at some ballistics results from Richard's gun. And it would turn out it was definitely not the gun that killed Barbara. And Hayward literally couldn't remember a time when he'd been more, frankly, shocked and disappointed. I mean, he really had Richard pegged as the killer. Richard basically was his only suspect, and he was a great one, especially since they had checked on his alibi and it didn't really hold up. The friends he said he was with that whole day actually said, well, we were with him, but not the whole day. So basically, there were large chunks of time on the day she went missing when Richard was unaccounted for. Hayward sighed and reminded himself that, just because the gun he owned wasn't a match, it didn't mean Richard was innocent. I mean, it's possible he used a different .357 and then just ditched the weapon. Still though, Hayward couldn't believe they were back to square one like this. He felt like he had done everything he could at this point. He talked to who he needed to talk to, he'd analyzed the evidence they'd gotten, and he had really nothing to show for it. Hayward was used to closing cases and giving families the answers they wanted, and now he was worried he was not going to be able to do that. And sure enough, over the coming months and then years, Hayward did continue to investigate this case, but the leads got fewer and fewer, and then eventually he got promoted, and then before long he was pulled into other cases, and eventually Barbara's case just went cold. In the fall of 2005, so over 25 years after Barbara's murder, Detective Todd Park sat on the floor by his desk in the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Department. Around him on the floor, it was covered with crime scene photos and interviews and evidence logs from the 1974 investigation of Barbara Rocky's murder. Park was a brand new homicide detective, and he had taken on this case after getting a call from one of Barbara's sisters, begging the sheriff's office to reopen it. And Park wasn't sure if it was maybe just new guy enthusiasm, but he was already pretty obsessed with trying to solve it. He really wanted to find some answers for the Rocky family, since they'd been wondering what happened to Barbara for now over 2 decades. And Park actually felt pretty optimistic about it. Because even though during the original investigation, they hadn't relied on DNA testing, they couldn't really even do DNA testing. Despite that, the investigators at the time had done a rape kit and saved all the evidence from the scene, like Barbara's clothes and even the dirt that was underneath her body, which meant that with the current advancements in DNA technology, there was a good chance they could actually solve this thing. Park had already sent a few items over for testing, but while he waited for the results, he was going over the details of the case to get a sense of how it was investigated back in 1974. And he found it was a pretty unusual case. The murder had initially been investigated as a personally motivated crime. But while the case was cold, police had also begun to consider the idea that maybe Barbara had been murdered by the notorious serial killer, Ted Bundy, that this was not personal, that she was just one of many victims. Ted Bundy had been arrested less than an hour away from where Barbara lived in Salt Lake City in 1975, just 1 year after her murder. And he had been killing college women all over the West Coast, including several in Utah, the same year Barbara was killed. But investigators in the late 1970s had ruled Ted Bundy out after determining he'd been committing a different murder in Washington state at the same time Barbara was killed, so he could not have been her killer. But it was still possible that Barbara had been killed by a different serial killer in the area. 1974 is notoriously known as the Year of Fear because there were so many killers operating in the United States at that time. But as Park read through the notes, he found himself agreeing with the original investigators' first instincts, that Barbara's murder must have been personal. Also, just the amount of times Barbara was shot seemed emotionally charged. And so Park believed Barbara's boyfriend, Richard Finder, had to be the killer. I mean, after all, Richard had been in the area at the time of the murder. He basically had no alibi. And, he brought up the fact that there was a missing murder weapon when the public didn't even know that. So he knows things about the crime scene that he shouldn't know. But Park felt like there were some other people in this case that also deserved a second look, like Barbara's best friend, Jerry Hicker. It was true he did have an alibi, and Barbara had told that pawn shop owner, before she was killed, that she was with her boyfriend, which she would not have referred to Jerry as. But if this was as emotional a crime as Park thought it was, Jerry had to be considered. After all, he was Barbara's closest friend at school, and maybe he heard she was leaving town and got mad at her. And then Barbara's roommates, they all seemed to have solid alibis, but maybe one of them had gotten somebody else to kill Barbara. I mean, Park knew the original investigators hadn't found any evidence of that, but they also hadn't seemed to spend much time on the roommates one way or another. They just kind of quickly ruled them out. But Park also knew it could be someone that they hadn't even considered yet, like the utility worker who actually found the body, or maybe another student at BYU who didn't like Barbara and considered her an outsider or a weirdo. Park wasn't sure yet, but he was confident that they'd be able to pick up some DNA somewhere in the evidence, and once they did, they'd find their killer. "2 years later, on an afternoon in October of 2007, Park paced around his office and periodically stopped to look at the phone on his desk. He was waiting for a call from the lab, and with each passing moment, he got more and more anxious. So at this point in Park's re-investigation of Barbara's murder, the DNA testing had basically gotten them nowhere. Over the last 2 years, the medical lab had gone over almost every single item from Barbara's case, like her rape kit swabs and her clothes. But they hadn't been able to get any DNA from anything. It either wasn't there, or was just too old and not preserved well enough. And so the only thing left to test was the dirt that the original investigators collected from underneath Barbara's body. Park actually had not originally sent in the dirt because he didn't think it would have any DNA inside of it. But it was now the only piece of evidence that he had left. So Park knew that when the lab called this time, he'd either be on his way to finding the killer's name, or his case would basically be over. But then Park's phone finally rang. He immediately picked it up, and his mouth went dry when he heard it was the lab on the other end. And before Park could even ask them, they told him they had a profile. They'd been able to find traces of DNA in that dirt sample taken from under Barbara's body. And when Park finally got his hands on that DNA profile and he ran it through their criminal database, he got a name. Based on DNA evidence and a decades-long investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Barbara Rockey on March 11th, 1974. Just before noon, the killer watched Barbara pull up to the sidewalk in her car. The killer immediately walked over and jumped inside and smiled at Barbara, and she smiled right back. And together, they drove to the pawn shop in Salt Lake City that Barbara wanted to go to. When they got there, Barbara hopped out of the car and went inside. And once she was inside, the killer moved over to the driver's seat, and so they basically were going to drive the car from that point forward. And as the killer sat in the driver's seat waiting for Barbara, their heart was racing. They couldn't wait for her to get back outside and get in the car because the killer was in love with her, and they had decided that today they were finally going to make their relationship physical. So when Barbara came outside and hopped in the passenger seat of the car after selling her necklace, the killer very excitedly turned to her and said, "Hey, there's some trails nearby. Why don't we go for a hike?" Barbara clearly hesitated, like she didn't really want to do this. But the killer knew Barbara was leaving Utah, and they knew she had written a goodbye note and was selling the necklace for funds to leave for good, so they kind of guilt-tripped her. They said, "Look, let's go enjoy the beautiful countryside before you leave town." Barbara shrugged and said, "Okay, fine." And so the killer very excitedly drove the car over to the canyon and parked near a picnic area. Then the two of them got out, and as they began walking towards the trail, the killer reached down and touched the outside of their pocket, just to make sure the gun that they had stolen from Barbara was still there. Now, they didn't know if they were going to use the gun or not, but they just wanted to make sure it was there and ready. And so for a while, the killer and Barbara just hiked along this trail, just chatting and making their way up and enjoying the scenery. But at some point, the killer they couldn't wait any longer. They had to make their move. And so they stopped Barbara, and the killer, after making sure nobody else was around, they moved forward and kind of made their move. They touched Barbara in a way that was very clearly meant to be romantic. But immediately Barbara kind of recoiled and jumped back and told the killer that she didn't want that, which immediately made the killer incredibly angry. And so the killer stepped towards her again and could see Barbara had this alarmed look on her face, which made them even more angry. So they pulled out Barbara's gun and they aimed it at her and then told her to take off her clothes. And Barbara, she was horrified, but, she did as she was told, but she intentionally was taking her time. As she took off a piece of clothing, she would painstakingly fold it very neatly, all the while begging the killer not to do this. And then after taking off all of her clothes and stacking them next to her, she continued to plead with the killer. But the killer was so humiliated and so angry that they decided enough was enough. And they shot Barbara right in the chest. And she crumpled to the ground, and they fired wildly several more times until Barbara went still. And then once Barbara was either dead or dying on the ground, the killer just panicked and turned and ran back down the trail, back to Barbara's car. They hopped in and they drove back to Provo and the BYU campus. But on the way there, they stopped and ditched Barbara's purse and the gun. And then when they actually got to Provo, the reason they parked Barbara's car down the road near that other apartment complex was so that when the killer got out of the car, Barbara's 7 roommates would not see them doing so. Then they fled, leaving Barbara's note in the car. Barbara's note was not a suicide note. It was a literal goodbye note that she had written for her roommates. But the killer figured it sort of seemed like a suicide note, so if they left it here, when they came back to find the car and find the note inside of it, they could tell the police that this seems like maybe Barbara has killed herself. It would send the police in a direction that would hopefully not lead back to the killer. It would turn out Barbara's killer was her best friend, Jerry Hicker. The original investigators didn't suspect Jerry at first, mainly because of his cooperation, and since he was the one who also first reported her missing. But they did begin to get suspicious of him when he eventually revealed his violent streak. The year after he killed Barbara, he was connected to a few different rape cases on campus. But they didn't have enough evidence to make an arrest until decades later, when the lab finally found DNA in the soil from the 1974 crime scene. They were able to match that profile to Jerry's DNA, which they had on file from his involvement in another unrelated crime. And so ultimately, Jerry killed Barbara with her own gun, which he had helped her buy so she could protect herself from killers just like him. By the time Jerry was arrested in 2007, he was dying of cancer. He confessed to Barbara's murder for a reduced sentence and served 5 years before he was released. He died in 2014. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen Podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On a crisp fall morning in 2007, a small airplane took flight over the forested town of Graham, Washington. The pilot was a detective with the Pierce County Sheriff's Department, and he was flying a somewhat unusual mission. He wasn't looking for a lost person or chasing a fleeing suspect. Instead, he was circling the sky above the scene of a double murder case that had him and his whole department stumped. The detective had run out of ideas on the ground, so he decided to take flight. Plus, he always thought better in the air, and he figured, while he was up there, he would literally get a new perspective on his evidence this way. He eventually circled over the house where the homicides took place, and then also began to kind of loosely circle the neighborhood. And that's when he noticed something. It was something that he wouldn't have noticed on the ground, but from up here, it was incredibly obvious. With a rush of adrenaline, he turned his plane around and headed back toward the airfield. He now had a real hunch, and if it was right, that means he just solved the case. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please tell the follow button you want to show them something funny, then put a mirror directly in front of them. Okay, let's get into today's story. On a Sunday morning in October of 2007, 30-year-old Brian Mock stood just inches away from his TV set, anxiously watching the Seattle Seahawks football team line up on the goal line about to run a play. His living room was filled with friends who'd come over to watch the game as well, and who were there to eat the eggs and bacon and biscuits and gravy that he'd cooked. On TV, the quarterback suddenly threw the ball to the wide receiver, but the pass was intercepted, and the living room erupted in boos and groans. Brian turned and kissed his 28-year-old wife, Beverly, anyway. Win or lose, Brian and Bev were still diehard Seahawk fans, and in fact were actually season ticket holders. And when the Seahawks were playing on the East Coast during away games like today, they would always invite their friends over for a breakfast watch party, because the games would start on the East Coast at 1 p.m. Eastern, and then on the West Coast where they were, that would be 10 a.m., hence the breakfast watch party. Brian and Bev loved hosting their friends. It was exactly what they had imagined doing when they bought this house a year earlier. The couple had gotten married about 18 months ago, and so they still were very much in their honeymoon phase. They lived in this modest ranch-style home with a nice front porch on the rural outskirts of Graham. They had 5 acres of land with breathtaking views of Mount Rainier out back. The neighborhood was sparsely populated. There was only one house close by with plenty of wide open space in between. Their closest neighbors lived in a trailer across a field behind their house. It was perfect for the couple. They were both very outdoorsy, not really cut out for typical office jobs and that kind of life. On their days off, they loved doing things like taking scenic rides on their motorcycles or kayaking in the Puget Sound. But no hobby trumped the pure joy of watching their beloved Seahawks play. The first half of the game came to an end, and Brian walked out of the living room and into the kitchen, where he topped off his cup of coffee. As he stood there drinking it, he noticed the kitchen trash was full, so he put his coffee down and grabbed the bag to take it outside. Brian walked to the bins out back and tossed the bag of trash inside, then turned to walk back into the house. As he did, he heard a car rumbling down the road. He looked up to see his neighbor, Daniel, sitting in the passenger seat, and the two men exchanged a quick wave. Daniel and his wife were the ones who lived in that trailer across the field, and like most of the residents around here, they enjoyed the quiet and mostly kept to themselves. But they were perfectly friendly. But just then, from inside the house, Brian heard somebody yelling angrily. Instantly, he knew it had to be his friend, Randy Holmes, and as he thought that, he felt a pit form in his stomach. Randy was clearly slurring his words, which was not out of character. He was only invited to this party because he was cousins with one of Brian's close friends. He could be okay, but he was young, just 21 years old, and a very heavy drinker. This was not the first time he'd come over and gotten belligerent. Bev also was not fond of Randy, and she and Brian also knew that Randy had actually been in trouble with the law before. They just didn't know the specifics. But Brian did still let him come over for parties, so as not to make things awkward with his cousin. So Brian picked up his pace and ran inside to see what was going on. In the living room, the mood was obviously tense. Randy was standing in the middle of the floor, yelling at no one in particular. Everybody else was giving him a wide berth, trying not to provoke him further. When Randy got like this, it was impossible to reason with him. Randy pointed at Brian's friend, Justin, and shouted drunk nonsense like he was deliberately trying to start a fight with him. Brian stepped forward, putting himself between Randy and the other party guests, and he told him to chill out, but that only set Randy off. Randy stumbled toward Brian, cursing and swaying on his unsteady feet until they were chest to chest. Then Randy shoved Brian. Not hard though, since he was too drunk to put any real power behind it. Besides, Brian was a big guy, and he wasn't exactly easily moved. In fact, if anything, the shove just sort of knocked Randy off balance. And Brian seized the opportunity to grab him by the arms and literally drag him across the living room to the front door. And when they got to the front door, Randy just kept on shouting, and Brian had to physically push him outside into the yard, and then he told Randy to just go home. Randy kept on cussing and yelling at Brian, but he also seemed to realize that he was physically outmatched here. He spit on the lawn and then gathered himself and ambled back to his car. Brian watched him weave his way off the property and drive down the street toward his own home, music blasting out of his car windows. The moment Randy was out of sight, Brian exhaled, his body full of adrenaline. He'd seen Randy pretty bad, but never that combative before, and it sort of unnerved him. He shook his head, wondering what set Randy off in the first place. Brian turned and walked back inside. The second half was about to start, and he hoped the Seahawks would start playing a bit better and maybe take his mind off what had just happened. That evening, Bev felt exhausted as she and Brian picked up after the party. She didn't have the stamina to fully clean the whole house, but she at least wanted to get all the beer cans and booze bottles into a recycling bin, maybe do a few dishes before bed. She told Brian she'd put on some music while they tidied up, and then she went to go grab her phone, which she had left in the kitchen all day charging. But when she got to the charger was still plugged into the wall, but her phone was gone. She called for Brian, asking if he had seen it, but he leaned his head into the kitchen and said no, not since earlier when it was charging right there on the counter. So he offered to help her find it. But as they began to tear apart the living room looking for her phone, a sinking feeling settled in Beverly's stomach. Randy had been in the kitchen a few minutes before his drunken outburst. Bev sighed and turned to Brian and asked him if Randy had used their bathroom while he was over. Brian shrugged and said, yeah, at least once or twice. He was here for a few hours. Bev sighed again. She was willing to bet that Randy very likely had been casing their new house while he wandered down the hallway to the toilet. Maybe he was taking things. She told Brian he better go check his hunting equipment. Then she ran into the bedroom and flipped open her jewelry box. And thankfully, nothing was missing. But Brian soon appeared in the doorway, very pale in the face, and said one of his guns was gone. And so now it became very clear that, Randy had probably taken the gun, taken her phone, and who knows what else. Bev asked if maybe they should just call the police. She was already scared of Randy, but now knowing that he very likely also stole from them, including a firearm, what's to say he wasn't planning to retaliate after Brian threw him out of their house? But Brian said no, we can't do that. Randy was a live wire. It was probably best not to confront him, especially not with police. Besides, everybody at the party was drinking. Maybe the gun and the phone were just misplaced. They should just finish cleaning the house in the morning, and very likely everything would turn up then. 6 weeks later, on the evening of Friday, November 16th, Brian packed up some of his hunting equipment so it'd be ready for the morning. Then he went to brush his teeth before bed. He had plans to go hunting before sunrise with his friend Justin White and wanted to get to bed early so he'd be well rested. Brian and Bev still hadn't found Bev's phone or Brian's gun that disappeared during that party. At this point, they were both certain that Randy had stolen both items, but they weren't sure how to get their stuff back without involving the police or making things awkward with Randy's cousin. So they had agreed to wait a bit longer and just see if Randy tried to return the items with some kind of flimsy excuse. In the meantime, Bev was okay without her phone and Brian had other guns. So Brian crawled into bed and soon his wife joined him. And in just a few minutes, they were both fast asleep. Around 5 a.m. the following morning, Brian's friend, Justin, pulled his SUV into Brian and Bev's driveway, ready to pick up Brian for a morning of hunting. However, the house was completely dark. Justin couldn't see any lights on inside. For a moment, Justin did just idle there in the driveway, waiting, taking the last few swigs out of his tumbler of coffee. But he'd been up for a while already, so he was wide awake and pretty anxious to get to their hunting spot. He thought about going up to the door to knock, but he knew if he did that, he very likely would wake up Beverly, since, it was the weekend and it's 5 a.m., so she very likely was asleep. So instead, Justin just let his headlights shine in through the front windows, figuring that if Brian was awake by now, he would see the light and come outside. But after about 5 minutes of that, when still Brian had not come outside, Justin decided this was a lost cause, and he pulled out of the driveway. He figured his friend must still be asleep, so Justin decided he would go hunting alone that day. He drove to the woods on the outskirts of Graham, and as he did, he kept checking his phone. He figured Brian would wake up any second, feel bad, and ask him to turn around and come pick him up. But the call never came. And then when Justin actually got to the hunting spot and was walking around out in the woods, he kept checking his phone, but still there was nothing. And then once the sun began to creep over the tree line, Justin started to get worried. By this point, Brian definitely should have been up, and it was weird that he hadn't called Justin to at least apologize for missing the trip. Finally, after a few hours of unsuccessful hunting, Justin walked back to his car and just called Brian, but there was no answer. At this point, something in his gut told him to go back to Brian's house to check on his friend one more time. Justin pulled into Brian and Bev's driveway for the second time that morning, and it looked like the house had not changed at all. No lights were on, the cars were in the same spot, it was all the same. And so Justin hopped out of his SUV and headed to the porch to ring the doorbell. But when he got to the top step, he looked down and noticed that one of the wooden panels on the door looked like it had been kicked in. He hadn't noticed this earlier, but it had been dark out, so maybe he hadn't seen it. And then Justin heard something coming from inside the house. He peered through one of the windows into the living room, and he realized the noise was coming from their TV set. and he saw something else too. It sort of looked like a pile of blankets on the floor. This was strange. Bev and Brian were always very neat and tidy, and so it was unlike them to leave blankets strewn around. So Justin squinted, trying to get a better look, and as he did, he realized he was not looking at a pile of blankets. In a panic, Justin ran for the door and tried it, but it was locked, so he rushed to his SUV, grabbed his phone, and called 911. Moments later, a Pierce County Sheriff's Department deputy was driving through Graham in his patrol car when a call from dispatch came over the radio. They requested assistance for a possible injured person at a house on 70th Avenue East. This deputy happened to be in the area, so he said he would go check it out. It took him less than 10 minutes to get to the address. As he pulled up, he saw a man standing in the driveway next to an SUV rubbing his hands together. The man seemed very nervous and began to approach the deputy's car. The man introduced himself as Justin and began kind of stumbling over his words as he recounted that morning. He said he pulled up to the house and it was dark, and then he circled back after a fruitless hunting trip, and his voice shook when he explained what he saw when he came back, that he could actually see somebody lying on the floor inside the house. The deputy told Justin to stay put and not to follow him into the house. Then the deputy placed a hand on the holster of his gun and crept up the front stairs. He knocked on the front door, eyeing the broken wood panel that Justin had mentioned. When there was no response, the deputy pushed the door open and stepped inside the house. Immediately, he saw a long trail of blood that led from the front door into the living room. This was clearly way too much blood to just be somebody's simple injury. I mean, this very likely had to be a crime scene. The deputy grabbed his radio and called the sheriff's department for backup. Then he unholstered his gun and began moving slowly, following the blood trail into the living room. The trail led the deputy to a bloody sheet lying on the floor. An arm and a leg protruded from underneath the sheet. The deputy looked at the outline of the lumpy mass underneath the sheet and saw it was clearly too big to just be one person. He knew he was looking at two bodies, dead on the floor. Now, the deputy knew, obviously, this was going to command his attention at some point, but for now, he needed to search the house and make sure there wasn't anybody here, like the perpetrator or perpetrators. And so with his gun drawn, he searched the whole house. And when he was satisfied that the house was indeed empty, he made his way back to the driveway to wait for backup. He also wanted to get more information from Justin. However, when the deputy got outside, he was surprised to find that the driveway was empty. Justin White was gone. About 10 minutes later, Detective Sergeant Ben Benson pulled up outside of Brian and Beverly Mock's house. Benson was a 23-year veteran of the force and the lead investigator. He arrived on the scene with one of his team members, Detective Jason Tate. The two detectives climbed out of their car, and Benson gave Tate a very encouraging nod. Tate had just made detective a few months ago, and this would be his first major homicide case. Benson surveyed the neighborhood, or what he could see of it, given how dispersed it was. He told Tate to take a walk around to get the lay of the land, and then start trying to reach the victim's family. Tate nodded and headed down the street. Meanwhile, Benson headed up the driveway to Brian and Beverly's home. A police team was already making the perimeter of the house with yellow caution tape. Benson dipped under the tape, and a deputy came down the driveway to meet him. The deputy told him that he was the one who responded to the 911 call. He motioned to the open front door and said that Brian and Beverly Mock's bodies were inside. Benson headed for the door, and the deputy followed. He told Benson about Justin White, the friend who had called 911 and then disappeared while the deputy was investigating the house. He said it just felt weird. Justin had seemed so concerned about his friend's well-being, but then didn't stick around to see if they were actually okay. Benson thanked the deputy. It was a good lead, one he had every intention of pursuing after he assessed the crime scene. Inside the house, a forensics team was already busy collecting evidence. Benson pulled on a pair of disposable gloves as he followed the trail of blood from the front door to the two bodies piled in the living room. There, he knelt down and lifted up the edge of the sheet that was covering them, and he was met with a grisly scene. Brian was face down on the ground, wearing jeans and a t-shirt. Bev was on top of him, but completely naked, and they had both clearly been shot repeatedly in the head. So it was no wonder the floor around the bodies was completely soaked in blood. There were pools of blood, smudges, and smears. It looked like someone did a poor job of trying to clean up. And when they couldn't sop up the mess, they just sort of covered the crime scene with a few blankets. Benson looked down at the trail of blood, which clearly had been created when the killer dragged Brian or Beverly from the front door into the living room. But the trail sort of looked strange. The blood was streaked with these long, thin lines. He couldn't imagine what had caused them. Benson moved around the living room looking for clues. Forensics had already found an imprint of a shoe in the pool of blood beneath the sheet, right by Brian's body. But otherwise, there were no footprints in the house. As Benson walked through the house, he began to notice blood smears in odd places, like on light switches, and there was a bloody smear on the door jamb leading into the bedroom. It looked like the killer tried to clean up the scene, but then ended up making a bigger mess in the process. And yet, for all the carnage, nothing else in the house was amiss. None of the drawers had been ripped from the dresser, the jewelry box looked untouched, there were plenty of valuables just lying around the house still. I mean, this clearly was not a burglary gone wrong. The killer had enough time to wander around and get blood smears everywhere, but apparently had no interest in stealing anything. Benson circled back to the living room, where forensics was still dusting and photographing the scene. He looked over at the kicked-in front door. The killer clearly was not let into the home, which meant they were either a stranger to Brian and Beverly, or someone they didn't want to let inside. All things considered, Benson's money was on the latter scenario. Someone that Brian and Beverly knew, but didn't trust, who showed up at their house, kicked down the door, and killed them. And given that Beverly was naked, Benson also had to consider the possibility that she was sexually assaulted as well. There was a lot of anger in this murder. It felt personal. But the question was, who wanted Brian and Bev dead? An hour later, Detective Benson pulled his car up to the house of Justin White. The house looked quiet, and Justin's SUV was in the driveway, so he appeared to be home. Benson walked up to the front door and knocked, and a moment later, Justin opened the door, looking pale. And his first question was, are Bev and Brian okay? Benson paused for a moment, and then told Justin that he likely already knew the answer to that question. Justin just sort of swallowed hard, but didn't respond. So Benson asked him why he fled the scene so quickly after the deputy arrived. Justin's voice trembled as he explained that he just couldn't stay there, not after what he'd seen or what he thought he'd seen on the floor inside the house. Brian was one of his best friends. He couldn't believe that something could happen to him. And then once the deputy showed up, it all just seemed too real. He just couldn't handle it, and so he panicked and drove off. He said he regretted leaving, but he just couldn't seem to turn the car around. Benson listened to this skeptically. On one hand, it was suspicious that Justin essentially fled the scene. But on the other hand, Benson knew that in high-stress situations, people did weird things, and sometimes they made themselves look really guilty out of just fear or panic. In Benson's experience, the best way to find the truth was to look for physical evidence that either corroborated or contradicted the stories they told. So, as Justin spoke, Benson scanned his hands and forearms, looking for any marks that maybe Brian or Beverly left. The crime scene he had just left was bloody and violent and brutal. I mean, the killer was very likely to show some signs of a fight. But Benson couldn't see any cuts or scratches on Justin. He wasn't sure what to think, but just to be safe, Benson told Justin he would likely have more questions for him in the coming days. By the time Benson got back to the Mock's home around noon, their quiet investigation had turned into a full-blown circus. The whole neighborhood was swarming with cops. Also, reporters from several local media outlets were stalking the street, asking for interviews with basically anyone who would give them the time of day. Benson did his best to dodge the journalists until he could duck under the yellow caution tape and retreat up the Mock's driveway. His partner, Detective Tate, was on the front porch to greet him, and he told Benson that he had just had a phone call with Beverly's mom, who supplied him with a viable suspect, a guy named Randy Holmes. Apparently, Brian and Bev thought that Randy stole a phone and a gun from their house about 6 weeks ago, the same day that Brian had to physically eject Randy from their party. Bev's mom said that she urged Beverly to go to the authorities, but the couple hadn't wanted to. But according to the mom, Randy always made Beverly nervous. To Benson, this all sounded like a motive. He told Tate, "Great work." That's when a uniformed officer approached Benson and Tate, saying that one of them needed to come talk with the neighbor who lived in the trailer at the edge of the Mock's property line. He apparently thought he saw something last night and wanted to help with the investigation. Tate knew that was his cue, and he told Benson he would call him with a report. Then he followed the officer across the field toward the trailer in question. Meanwhile, Benson headed back into the office. He wanted to learn whatever he could about Randy Holmes, including if he had a criminal record. It didn't take long for Benson to discover that not only did Randy have a record, but it was pretty extensive. Before the age of 21, Randy had been arrested for a litany of crimes, including possession of a stolen vehicle, forgery, and violating a restraining order. And that last one was of particular interest because it suggested that Randy could be capable of violence. Benson grabbed the phone on his desk and called Detective Tate. He told Tate that Randy was looking like a pretty good suspect, and he wanted to go and find him. Tate agreed and thought that was a good idea, and he also told Benson that he had some news too. He had just wrapped up an interview with Daniel and Jennifer Tavares, the husband and wife who lived in the trailer across the field from Brian and Beverly, and the couple said they didn't know the Mocks very well, but David said he did see something strange at the Mocks house that morning. Around 7 a.m., Daniel said he had heard gunshots outside. There were a lot of hunters in the area, so gunshots were sort of common this time of the year, but he said he was still curious, so when he heard them, he'd peeked out his blinds towards the Mocks house in time to see two men run out of Brian and Beverly's home, jump into a red pickup truck in the driveway, and peel out. Daniel said he did get a really good look at one of the two men. That guy had a ponytail that was tied back, and his face was pockmarked and scraggly, like he hadn't shaved in a couple of days. As for the second guy, Daniel said he really didn't get a good look at him, but he could see enough to know that it definitely was a man. And so after saying all this, Tate followed up and asked Benson, hey, does that description match Randy? Benson thought for a minute. The photo he had seen of Randy did not show Randy having long hair or a pockmarked face. But, Daniel didn't get a good look at the second guy, and so maybe the second guy could have been Randy. Either way, such a detailed description would definitely help them figure out if Randy was their guy or involved. Benson told Tate to wrap up what he was doing and head back to the station. They had a suspect to track down. About 40 minutes later, Benson and Tate pulled down a dark residential street in Graham, looking for what they hoped would be Randy's home. Randy had given multiple different addresses over the years during different arrests, so Tate and Benson were going to try all of them, starting with the most recent. They squinted out the windows looking for house numbers, and for a moment they thought they found his home, but then realized the number on that house had an extra digit. It took 2 more sweeps of the street for Benson and Tate to realize that, in fact, none of the house numbers on the street matched the address Randy had given his arresting officers. So either the booking officer had made a mistake, or Randy had given a fake address. Tate looked down at his notebook, where he'd scribbled all of Randy's known addresses. He wondered aloud how many of them would be phony. But Benson, he just sighed, and said this gave him even more reason to suspect Randy. Everything about this guy was sketchy. The second address on their list took them to a real house, which was promising. But when they knocked on the front door, a middle-aged woman answered. She admitted to being Randy's mom, but said she hadn't seen her son in days, and she had no idea where he was. She looked genuinely concerned as she asked if he was in some kind of trouble. Benson felt bad for her. It seemed like this was definitely not the first time cops had come around looking for her son. So he handed her his card and told her he just had a few questions for Randy about a case they were working on. Randy's mother took it and promised to call if her son showed up. Back in the car, Benson pulled on his seatbelt. Meanwhile, Tate crossed off Randy's mother's address and rattled off the next house to try. Under the circumstances, it was bad news that not even Randy's mom could find him, and so Benson just hoped that he and Tate would have better luck. He pulled his car down the street and headed west, winding his way through Graham. The third address took them all the way to the outskirts of town, where the streetlights disappeared and the road was suddenly full of potholes. Benson and Tate bounced their way down the uneven road, looking for Randy's house. Benson was beginning to think this was just another wild goose chase when he suddenly slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, kicking up a cloud of dirt, because there, right up ahead, was a smoldering pile of rubble where Randy's alleged third home used to be. But all that was left were the remains of a charred foundation. The house had been burnt to the ground, and recently too. Tate climbed out of the car and went to go walk the perimeter of the burned-down home. Benson just leaned on the hood of the car, scratching his head. He was starting to worry that Randy was on the run. By the time Benson and Tate got back to the station, the preliminary results from the medical examiner had arrived, and so Benson sat at his desk looking over the report, and the details of the murder were absolutely depraved. Both Brian and Bev had been shot in the head 3 times at close range with a .22 caliber revolver. But to Benson's surprise, the rape kit used for Beverly came back negative, which meant that she suffered no sexual assault either pre- or post-mortem, despite having been found nude. Benson also had a report from the forensics department, analyzing a palm print lifted from the blood smear on the bedroom door jamb, as well as the bloody shoe print they spotted by the bodies. They hadn't matched the palm print to anybody in the system yet, but they would run the prints against any that Benson collected from suspects, and so Benson really needed to find Randy Holmes. But before he could even start to formulate a new plan, Benson's phone rang. And when he answered, he was shocked, because the voice on the other line belonged to none other than his number one suspect, Randy Holmes. Randy said his mom told him that Detective Benson was looking for him. She hadn't said what it was about, but he'd heard about the murders of Brian and Beverly, and he figured it had to be related. He said he was staying with a friend about 10 miles away and wanted to come in and clear his name. Randy swore he had an alibi for the night of the murder, along with several friends who could back up his story. Now, Benson had not been expecting this. So, pretty aggressively, he asked Randy for the names and phone numbers of these so-called friends because he was going to call each and every one of them and ask them questions about Randy's alibi. Benson was hoping that the way he was asking, being sort of aggressive on purpose, would maybe get Randy to flinch, or maybe refuse to give him contact information to show he was guilty. But Randy reacted by saying, yeah, that's fine, all good. And then he encouraged Benson to make those calls, call all of them. And so Benson scribbled down the information as Randy rattled off a handful of names. Then, Benson asked Randy point blank, did he steal a gun and a phone from the Mock's house on the day of the football watch party? This was a test to see if Randy would lie. But Randy didn't hesitate. Yes, he said. Yes, he did. He said he knew all of this made him look horrible, but he swore he did not hurt Brian or Beverly. Trying hard not to be completely thrown off by Randy's apparent honesty, Benson asked for the address where Randy was currently staying. He told Randy he was going to send Tate over to check out the stolen gun to see if it matched the weapon that killed Brian and Beverly. And Randy eagerly gave him the address. He told him the gun was with him right now and he'd be waiting for Detective Tate. Benson hung up and just sat there for a minute, absorbing this new twist. Then he stood up and walked across the room to Tate's desk. He handed over the address and asked him to go check it out. Then Benson got to work calling all of Randy's friends. An hour later, Benson sat dejectedly at his desk, sipping lukewarm coffee and skimming through his notes on the case so far. He just hung up with the last of Randy's friends, all of whom had confirmed that they were with Randy at a party on the night of the murder. Benson knew they could be lying to cover for their friend, but they all gave intricate details about the party, and all of those details matched. Their accounts were too nuanced and too overlapping to be lies. Benson had to reconcile the fact that Randy's whereabouts were accounted for during the murder. Just a few hours ago, he thought this case was basically solved. Now, he was back to square one. Just then, his phone rang. Benson answered and heard Tate's voice. He said he was at Randy's house and he had some more bad news. The stolen gun was not a match. Benson sighed and said, yep, he had a feeling that was going to be the case. Benson took another sip of coffee and he began to sift through more documents in the case file. He grabbed the interview that Tate conducted with Brian and Beverly's neighbor, the guy who lived in the trailer across the field, Daniel Tavares, who had seen the two men running out of the Mock's house. Benson wondered if he should go speak to Daniel again, just to see if maybe he remembered any other details that could help them crack the case. Or maybe, Benson thought, he should send Tate out to canvass again, this time asking neighbors if they recognized the man from Daniel's description, the guy with the ponytail and the pockmarked face. But whatever he decided to do, it was going to have to wait until tomorrow. This was only the first day of the investigation, and it was late. Benson and Tate both needed to go home and get some sleep. The next morning, on Sunday, Sergeant Benson climbed into the cockpit of a single-engine plane at the airstrip in Graham. He hoped that by flying over the Mock's home, it could help him sort of reframe the evidence and show him what clues he could be missing. Benson glided through the blue skies, reviewing the details of the case in his mind over and over again. The door was kicked in, the victims' bodies were piled on top of one another and covered with a sheet. Their friend Justin was at the scene around the time of the murders, but claimed that everything seemed normal until he came back hours later. Randy Holmes technically had a motive, but no murder weapon and a decent alibi. And a neighbor saw two men running out of the Mock's home around 7 a.m., one with a pockmarked face and the ponytail. What was he missing? Benson finally reached the Mock's home and looked down from the cockpit. Even at this height, he could clearly see the yellow caution tape lining their property. Benson scanned all around the sparsely populated neighborhood below, quickly spotting Daniel Tavares' trailer parked across the field. He saw a trailer park even further down the road. Brian's friend Justin lived close, and Randy's mom's house wasn't that far away either. And as Benson was sort of staring around at all the places he had been on the ground with his partner, he noticed something he had totally overlooked while he was on the ground. He turned the plane around and headed right back to the airstrip. He now needed just one more piece of physical evidence and one more interview, and then he was certain he would be able to solve this case. Less than an hour later, Benson stood outside the sheriff's station as a squad car pulled up with his interview subject inside. Not because his subject was under arrest, they just didn't have a car, and so needed a ride to the station. It had just rained out, and Benson watched as his subject stepped out of the cruiser and splashed through puddles to the station door to meet him. Benson thanked his subject again for agreeing to talk, and then led them inside. While Benson walked with the subject deeper into the station to an interview room, Detective Tate passed by them on his way towards the front door. As Benson opened up the interview room door and he and his subject began to go inside, Detective Tate reached the front door, stopped, and bent down. By the time Benson was actually sitting down opposite his subject inside of that room, Tate, out near the front door, was standing back up and smiling. Based on evidence and interviews collected over the course of 2 days by the Pierce County Sheriff's Department, this is what authorities believe happened to Brian and Beverly Mock on the morning of November 17, 2007. The killer arrived at Brian and Beverly's house early in the morning, a .22 caliber revolver in hand. They were furious because they felt like Brian had disrespected them, and the killer did not let anyone disrespect them, not even their own mother. The killer walked up to the front door and knocked, but even though they could hear the TV on inside, nobody answered. So suddenly, in a rage, the killer just kicked in the door and stormed inside. From inside the house, Brian looked up in total shock, but the killer didn't hesitate. They raised their gun and fired. The first bullet struck Brian in the side of the head, and he crumpled to the ground, but the killer wasn't done. They walked over to Brian's body and fired 2 more shots directly into the back of Brian's head. The killer was about to leave, but they heard footsteps coming down the hallway. The killer looked up to see Beverly, completely naked, her face frozen in terror. She screamed and ran for the front door, but the killer fired 2 more shots, and both struck her in the back of the head. She fell. The killer stalked over to her, pressed the gun to her forehead, and pulled the trigger 1 more time. Then they dragged her lifeless body over to her husband's and stacked her right on top. It was only then that the killer looked around and saw the blood all over the house and realized what a mess they had made. They flicked on a few lights to see what they were doing, then went to the kitchen to find some cleaning supplies. The killer found a broom and tried their best to wipe up the blood on the floor with it, but it didn't do any good. It just smeared the blood around, creating these long, thin streaks across the blood trail that would later confuse detectives. The killer realized they had to get creative, so they went into the master bedroom looking for extra blankets. As they walked through the threshold, they grabbed the door jamb, leaving behind a bloody smear. Then they opened up the closet and found a spare sheet. They carried it back out to the living room and used it to cover Brian and Beverly's bodies. The killer turned off all the light switches they had turned on and then tried to wipe the blood off those switches, and then, feeling satisfied, they headed for the front door. But on their way, they stepped on the sheet, leaving behind a telltale shoe print of blood. Later that morning, a detective from the Pierce County Sheriff's Department would show up at the killer's front door, asking questions about Brian and Beverly Mock. But unbeknownst to any of the detectives, the killer had a dark and horrifying criminal past, and their many experiences with the police had turned them into a very good liar. So the killer was ready with a story that the police would believe for a full 24 hours. That is, until Detective Benson flew his plane over the crime scene and realized that story was physically impossible. That flight, that discovery, would trigger 1 more interview, and the subject was the killer. And because it had just rained when they walked through the entryway of the police station to the interview room, the killer would leave a shoe print on the station floor that Detective Tate would find. And that print would match the bloody footprint found at the crime scene. The killer was Brian and Beverly Mock's neighbor, Daniel Tavares. From the air, Benson had realized that Daniel's story about seeing 2 men running out of the Mock's house was actually impossible, because from the air, he could clearly see that Daniel's home was simply too far away from the Mock's home to actually see that. And so as soon as Benson made this realization, he rushed to the police station and summoned Daniel in for an interview. He also ran Daniel's name through the computer system looking for a criminal record. And what he found would go on to shock the entire country. Because Daniel Tavares had been released from a prison in Massachusetts only a few months earlier after serving 16 years for stabbing his own mother to death. Daniel was not supposed to leave the state of Massachusetts, but he had, and he fled to Washington, and no one from Massachusetts had come to look for him. So Daniel was technically already on the run from the law when he murdered the Mocks. And yet, Daniel was so confident in his lie that when he went to the police station to be interviewed that last time, which would also be the day he would be arrested, he wore the same boots that he had on at the time of the murder. However, once Benson finally confronted Daniel with all the police knew, including the fact they had matched the print he had left in the station to the one at the crime scene, Daniel would confess to the murders. He claimed he had done it because Brian apparently owed him $50 and also had somehow disrespected him. Daniel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Zeth Lundy. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the MrBallen Podcast, as well as MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.